The coffee was cold before he lifted it. 3 days in the saddle, 3 days of white nothing. And now he was sitting on the porch of a ranch that was already finished. He just hadn't buried it yet. He set his boots by the door. That's how a man quits in cattle country. Not with words, just boots beside a door that used to mean something. Then the sound came, hooves on frozen ground. Not one horse, not two. Too many to count before his body was already standing. A woman came around the bend in the trail. Behind her 12 horses. His horses. She stopped them in his yard like she'd been here before. Like she knew exactly what she was riding into. She hadn't been. He could see that in the way she looked at him. Like she was already calculating something he didn't have the numbers for yet. The coffee was cold. Wade Holt knew it before he lifted the cup. He lifted it anyway, because lifting it gave his hands something to do, and his hands needed something to do, or they would start working through the numbers again. The numbers had been running since before he woke up, which was a lie he told himself because he had not actually slept. He had lain in the dark with his boots still on until sometime past midnight, when he finally accepted that the boots were not going anywhere, and neither was he, and he pulled them off and set them beside the door. Not inside the room, beside the door. As though he had not yet committed to being inside, he was committed now. Sitting on the porch step in the gray before dawn, the coffee cooling in his hand, watching the trail come down off the switchback through morning fog that sat low over the frozen ground. The fog was the same color as nothing. He watched it the way a man watches a thing he has stopped expecting to change. 3 days since the storm hit the upper pasture like something with a personal grievance. He had ridden every draw and gully from the home place to the Sulphur Creek fork twice, once in the worst of it and once after, when the wind dropped but the temperature did not, when the going was easier on the horse but harder on the eyes, because everything was white and flat, and the hoof prints filled in within the hour. He had found 2 of the fence line posts down, and the gate on the lower section bent where something had hit it hard in the dark. He had found the remains of the windbreak, where 3 of the old cottonwoods finally gave up and went over. He had found nothing else. Nothing with hooves and a brand, nothing that was his. 12 horses. The whole breeding string. 11 years of deliberate decisions, each one made against the arithmetic of what he could afford, and in favor of what he knew he was working toward. The sorrel mare he had bought off a man in the valley who did not know what he had, and Wade did, which was a thing that happened once, twice in a working life if you were paying attention and patient enough to wait. The 3-year-old fillies out of her, which he had not sold when the offers came, because he could see what they would become, and the buyers could only see what they were. The dark chestnut gelding who moved wrong in the left shoulder, but moved every other way better than anything Wade had seen in this valley, or the one east of it. All of them gone into that white wall of wind and pressure and cold, and not one of them had the sense or the luck to find the lower fence line and come down on their own. He had stopped looking the evening before, pulled the saddle off his horse himself because Ira, the hand he kept on through late fall, had gone to his brother's place in the valley when the storm looked bad, and Wade had not sent word to bring him back because there was no point. A man alone unsaddles his own horse. A man alone does a lot of things that are not particular hardships, just facts of the arrangement. Wade had done them for 15 years. He set his boots by the door and he let it be. There was a particular arithmetic to that moment, and he knew it as well as he knew any of the numbers he had been running. 53 years old. Both knees had opinions about stairs and cold mornings, the left one louder than the right, since he came off a young horse badly 12 years back, and the bone had knit the way. Bone knits when you do not rest it properly, because there is no rest when there is work. A ranch that had cleared enough in a good year to replace what wore out and feed what needed feeding, and put a small amount against the debt that had been with him so long. He had stopped thinking of it as debt and started thinking of it as weather, present and unremarkable. And now no horses. The breeding string gone. The thing he had been building, specifically and patiently and at considerable personal cost, in money and in choices not taken for 11 years. Gone in a single night into the dark and the wind. The arithmetic did not work. At a certain point a man stops fighting the numbers and accepts what they are saying. The numbers were saying something clear and he had accepted it. He had set his boots beside the door and decided that was the end of the particular chapter he had been living in, and that whatever came next would be a different kind of life than the one he had been building. He did not know exactly what kind. He sat on the step with the cold coffee and watched the fog and did not try to figure it out yet. There is a particular quiet that comes over a person when they stop fighting a thing. He had felt it once before, in the bad stretch 12 years back when he had sold down to the 2 best studs and let everything else go. Same feeling then. Like the land itself goes still because it knows something has been settled, and there is no point in the noise anymore. He had felt it the morning after Margaret died, sitting in the same kitchen in the same chair, looking at the same window while the same land went gray before dawn. That particular stillness, the absence of the future you had been living toward. He thought about Margaret now because the coffee was cold and the fog was the same color as nothing, and it was the kind of morning that brought her back without permission. She had been better at the numbers than he was. Not better at the ranching. Not better at knowing which animal to breed to which and when to sell and when to hold. Those were his. But better at the columns. Better at looking at what was actually there and saying it plainly. She had sat across from him at that same table in the second winter here, when the first bad stretch hit and he had been afraid to open the ledger. Genuinely afraid the way a man is afraid of the thing he cannot outwork. And she had opened it herself and gone through it line by line in that particular way she had, where her face gave nothing away, until she had the whole picture, and then she would look up and tell him what the picture was. Good news or bad, she told it the same. He had learned more about his own ranch from watching her read a ledger than he had learned from any of the years before she arrived. She had been gone 15 years. He still missed the way she read a ledger. That was the kind of morning it was. Sitting on the step with the cold cup, watching the fog shift over the frozen ground, thinking about numbers and about Margaret and about whether 53 was too old to start over a second time. He had an answer to that question. He was fairly sure it was yes. He sat with the certainty of it, and the fog moved, and the gray in the east grew lighter without becoming anything yet, just less dark. Then he heard them. You know the sound. If you have worked horses your whole life, you know the sound before you know it. Something in the ear that has been calibrated by years of mornings and evenings and midnight checks recognizes it without instruction. Hooves on frozen ground, spread out. Not one animal and not two, but the particular scatter of a group moving together. The way they spread when they feel the space around them and close when the terrain tightens. He heard it before he saw anything, and his body went ahead of his mind. He was standing before he decided to stand. The cold cup still in his hand. They came around the bend in the trail single file, bunched at the front where the switchback narrows to one animal's width, and they spilled into wider ground and spread. And he counted them as they cleared the rock face. 1, 2. He got to 8 before he stopped counting and started trying to understand what he was looking at behind them. A woman on a gray mule. Not a pretty mule. Not the kind of animal you point at and say, look at that. The kind you look at and think, that animal has been places and has opinions about going back. Copper-gray hide marked up one shoulder where something had scraped it. Ears that moved independent of each other, taking in different information from different directions simultaneously. A build that was all function and no performance. The woman on his back matched him in that respect. A duster coat the color of old canvas, weathered to the particular shade that comes from rain and sun in alternation over enough seasons that the original color is a matter of speculation. A working skirt the color of weathered stone, thick enough to do double duty as insulation. Boots that had been oiled recently, which told him something, because a person who oils their boots in the middle of a journey is a person who understands that equipment is not decorative. And a hat, wide-brimmed dark, sitting low on her ears in the way of a hat that does not belong to the person wearing it, too large by a full size, kept from falling only by the cant of her head against the wind, one hand loose on the reins, the other resting on her thigh, holding a coiled rope. She drove those horses into his front yard and stopped them there like she had been to this place before, which she had not. He could tell by the way she looked at the house, quick and measuring, the glance of someone filing information for future use, rather than recognizing what they already knew. She looked at the house, then at the barn, then at the battered gate on the south pasture and the brand plate nailed to its post, then at him. "These yours?" He said they were. Found them in a box canyon up past the second ridge. Had to work around to get above them before they'd move. The big sorrel mare had herself wedged between two rock faces, hind leg caught in a crack in the granite. Had to work her out slow. She said this the way a person reports on a job that needed doing, not with the implication of heroism, but with the practical summary of effort. That's what took the morning. Wade finished counting. 12. He counted them again. 12. They're sound, she said. The mare will need watching for a day or two. That leg isn't broke, but she was pulling against it a while before I got there. The rest of them are cold and they're hungry, but they're sound. He looked at all of them, at the fact of them being here, in this yard, when 3 hours ago he had concluded they were gone. How'd you know they were mine? She nodded toward the south pasture gate. Brand plate on the post. Same mark on every animal in that string. Wasn't hard to figure. Her name was Eleanor Cross, she said, Ellie. She was 29 days out of a city back east, which was the piece of information that Kim longest to make sense of. Not because it was complicated, but because it asked him to hold several things in his mind at the same time, and his mind was still catching up to the fact of the horses standing in his yard. She told him about the traveling party she had come west with, a group of women heading for the valley settlements, organized through connections she did not elaborate on. They had broken up at the Bitterroot crossing 3 weeks back. One of the wagons had lost a wheel beyond fixing, and the delay had cost them the window before the first snow. 2 of the women had turned back. The rest had scattered to different routes, depending on where they were headed and who was waiting. She had not been headed to anyone in particular. She told him this with the same matter-of-fact delivery she had used for everything else, as though it were a logistical detail rather than the kind of information that makes people look at a person differently. She was making for Caldwell Wells, another 4 days' ride west, maybe 5 if the weather turned again. There was a woman there who ran a dry goods operation and had put out word through regional contacts that she needed someone who could keep books and was not afraid of long hours. Wade led the horses into the south pasture while Ellie watered the mule. She did not ask where the water trough was. She found it, led Copper to it, let him drink, checked his front feet while he drank with the particular efficiency of someone for whom foot care was not a special occasion but a standard habit. He got the sorrel mare into the small paddock by herself and checked the leg. She had been right, swelling from the knee down but nothing broken, weight-bearing when he watched her move, which was the thing that mattered. He stood in the paddock for a while, with his hand on her neck, and she stood with him the way the good ones do, quiet and present, already beginning to settle down from whatever the canyon had been. He stayed there longer than he needed to. He was doing the thing he had done on the step with the cold coffee. Except now it was different, because the step had been the end of something, and this paddock was not. He could not yet determine what it was instead. She stayed for supper, because he asked her to, and because the light was already going, and there was no sense in pushing a tired mule up the trail in the cold when there was a barn and a warm stove available. That was the practical version. The honest version included the fact that he asked twice before she agreed, and that she looked at the barn before she looked at the house, making sure the animals were settled before she thought about herself. Wade cooked what he had, which was not much. Salt pork and cornbread and the last of a jar of pickled beets he had been saving without any specific occasion in mind, which he now understood had been waiting for this one without his knowledge. She ate everything and did not comment on it either direction, which he appreciated. There is a particular performance some people make about eating plain food, especially people who did not expect plain food, and she did not make it. She ate and was finished, and it was done. They sat at the table after with coffee and talked about the horses. He had not talked about the horses to anyone in particular for some time. Chester, born at the feed store, listened politely when the subject came up, but Chester's interest was commercial rather than genuine, and the men Wade occasionally dealt with in the valley either had their own stock or no interest in stock, and the conversation always turned to weather or water rights within 2 minutes. He had not sat at this table and talked about what he was actually working toward, with the breeding decisions, and why he had made the ones he had made since the last time Margaret had been in the chair across from him, which was 15 years ago, and which he did not let himself think about directly, only sideways. Ellie asked questions that were not polite questions. The sorrel mare. What do you expect her to throw? She's proved out twice. Both fillies. Both moved right. The chestnut gelding with the flaxen mane. The one in the northwest corner of the pasture, he's not for sale. Wade looked at her. What makes you say that? Because you watched him every time you went to check on the mare. Not the same way you watched the others. He had not noticed he was doing that. He said as much. You were doing it, she said. Not unkind. Just accurate. She had grown up on a farm in the Plains region. She told him when he asked. The asking felt natural in a way that asking did not usually feel natural to him, which he noted without examining too closely. Both horses and mules on the farm, she said, which explained Copper, and also explained certain things about how she handled animals. That particular economy of motion that comes from years of working around large creatures that could hurt you and that you could not afford to alienate. He asked what had brought her west. She thought up about it before she answered, not hesitating, which implies uncertainty, but genuinely thinking, which is different. Taking the question seriously enough to give it a real answer, instead of the first available one. There was nothing left to stay for, she said. That's the honest answer. My mother died 2 years ago. The farm went to pay what was owed. I was in the city keeping books for a freight company, living in a rooming house. It was a good enough life. She paused. But it was the same day every day, and I'm not made for that. Wade understood this in a particular and specific way. He did not say so. Some things you understand better for not saying them out loud. She slept in the spare room and was awake before him, which he had not expected. When Wade came out to the kitchen in his flannel shirt and canvas pants and work boots, pulling his suspenders up, she had already been to the barn and checked the sorrel mare's leg and come back. She told him the swelling was down and the mare was putting weight on it, which was good news. Then she asked if she could use the flour and salt to make proper biscuits, because the cornbread last night had been fine, but she had been thinking about biscuits. He told her to help herself. She made biscuits. She also found the half-smoked ham he had forgotten about in the cold storage and sliced it thin and fried it. There were eggs from the 3 hens he kept out of habit rather than any particular calculation, and she scrambled them in the drippings from the ham, which was not how he usually did it, but was better than how he usually did it. They ate at the table as the morning came gray and cold through the window glass, and she drank her coffee black and looked out at the pasture while she ate, watching the horses move in the thin early light, studying them the way she studied things, with the quiet intentionality of someone who sees observation as part of the work. The dark chestnut with the flaxen mane, she said. He's off. Wade looked out. The horses were moving around the hay he had pitched in before breakfast. Which one? The one I mentioned last night. Watch how he carries the left shoulder when he steps out. He watched. She was right. There was a slight stiffness in how he committed to that step, subtle enough that you would miss it if you were looking for something else, obvious enough once she had pointed you at it. He hit something in the storm, probably. Running in the dark, probably. He'll work it out. She said it the way you say something you know to be true, not the way you say something you hope is true, and went back to her coffee. Wade thought about that for a moment. He thought about the fact that she had been here less than 24 hours and had already correctly identified 2 things about his horses that he had not been looking at squarely. The sorrel's recovery, the chestnut's shoulder, neither of them complicated. Both of them, the kind of thing that requires paying attention of a certain quality to notice. The quality that comes from knowing how animals should move and what it means when they don't. The second storm hit that afternoon. She had loaded Copper and said her goodbyes, and gotten perhaps a mile down the trail, when it came in from the north, fast the way the second storms of the season come fast, as though the country has already worked out the logistics and is just executing the plan. She came back because she had the sense not to push a mule into a mountain blizzard, and the self-possession not to look upset about it. She came in through the front door shaking snow from the wide hat that was not hers, and said she supposed she would need the spare room another night. She stayed 4 more days. In those 4 days, Wade Holt learned several things about Eleanor Cross. She did not leave work undone. She had a system for every task she took on, a logic that was not always obvious until you watched it through to completion, and then was entirely obvious. The kind of efficiency that comes from having done things the wrong way first and learned from it. The way she organized the kitchen. The way she kept track of what had been used and what needed replacing without writing it down, carrying it in some internal accounting that was as natural to her as breathing. On the second morning, she found the crack in the mortar around the stovepipe junction, where it went through the kitchen wall. A crack that had been there since the previous winter and that Wade had noted and then set aside because there was always something more urgent. She pointed it out and asked if he had the lime and sand to fix it. He did. He mixed the patch, and she watched him apply it with the focused attention of someone filing information away for future use. And she asked one question about the ratio, why this proportion rather than another, and he explained it, and he could see from the way she listened that she was not asking to make conversation. She was asking because she intended to know the answer. The third day she rehung the kitchen door. The door had been dragging on the sill for 2 winters, swollen in the frame where the wood had taken moisture and never fully dried out. Wade had lived with it, the way you live with the things that are annoying but not urgent, stepping over them in your mind, the same way you step over a threshold. He came in from noon rounds, and the door moved clean and smooth when he pushed it open, and he stood there for a moment before he realized what had changed. She did not mention it before or after. The door simply moved the way a door should move. That was the whole of it. She was not soft. That was the clearest way to say it. Not hard and not cold. Those were different things. But she was not soft. She had done difficult things and expected to do more difficult things, and she did not waste time being distressed about that condition. She could sit quiet in a room, without making the quiet feel like something was wrong, which was rarer than people thought, and something that Wade noticed without having a word for what he was noticing. She also read. She had 2 books in her saddlebag, both of them read already on the trail, she said, so when she found the 3 volumes on the shelf above Wade's desk, she asked if she could borrow one. He told her there was not much to choose from: a ranching almanac several years out of date, a history of the territory published by a man in the capital, who had clearly done most of his research from other books, rather than from the territory itself, and a novel that Margaret had brought from her mother's house, and that Wade had read twice, because it was the only fiction in the building. Ellie took the history of the territory. She read half of it the first evening, and the rest of it the second, and on the third night she talked about it at supper. Not about what happened, but about what it meant, the land grant system, and what the specific terms had meant for settlement patterns, where the water rights had been drawn, and why those particular lines had made sense in the wet years, and created the conflicts they had created in the dry ones. She had been building a picture of the place she was riding into, learning its history the way you learn the history of an animal before you work with it, so you understand why it responds the way it does. The 4th night the weather broke. They sat by the stone fireplace after supper, and Wade told her more about the ranch than he had told anyone in years. The original claim, what this ground had looked like when he first ran cattle on it, why he had shifted to horses. The 2 bad years when he had sold down to the 2 best studs and started over. He had not talked about those years in this way since Margaret, and the talking felt strange in his mouth, the way any unused thing feels strange when you pick it up again. But Ellie listened without filling the pauses with reassurance, which would have been the wrong thing, and he kept going. She said, when he had come to the end of it, but you built it back. Not a question, just an acknowledgement of what the story had been. Took a while, he said. Most things do, she said. Then she asked about Margaret. He did not know why he told her. He did not talk about Margaret easily or often or with most people, and when he did it was in the careful way of someone handling something they do not want to drop. But he told Ellie, the way they had worked this place together in the early years, the way Margaret had read a ledger, the way the illness had come on slow and then fast and then she was gone, and the way the ranch had gotten harder after, not just in the labor of it but in the purpose. When you are doing a thing alone, the point of it gets harder to locate. You know what you are doing but not as clearly why, and the why is what gets you through the parts when the what is brutal. Ellie listened to all of it. She did not say she was sorry, which he had heard enough times that the words had worn smooth as creek stone and meant approximately nothing anymore. She said, she sounds like someone worth knowing. She was, he told her. And you've run this place 15 years without her. He had. She nodded. And then she let it alone, which was exactly right. The 5th morning was clear and cold, and there was no good reason for her not to ride. Copper was rested and sound. The trail was passable. She had a destination and a purpose, and he had no claim on her time or her direction. He had fed and tacked the mule before she came out to the porch in her duster, and her oversized hat, and her oiled boots, and he brought Copper around to the yard, and she tied her bag to the saddle rings with the quick professional knots of someone who has done that particular task enough times for the hands to have their own memory of it. She stood beside the mule for a moment in the cold morning light. The people in the valley, she said, the ones who know you, Do they think poorly of you? It was a strange question, and he did not answer it immediately. He thought about Chester Bourne, and the way Chester's manner had shifted over the past 2 years. Still polite, but with a certain careful distance to the politeness. The distance of a man managing his exposure. He thought about Silas Greer, and the 2 years of silence from a buyer who had once been reliable and consistent, and had simply stopped without explanation. He thought about the way a small valley keeps its accounting, running a tally on a man that he never sees, but that shapes everything. The prices he is offered, the credit he is extended, the quality of the greetings he receives at the general store on a Tuesday in November. When you lose a breeding string to a storm, and when that is your second bad stretch in a decade, people remember. Not with malice, mostly. Just as data, some do, he said. She looked at him the way she looked at the horses. That particular quality of attention, not not judgmental, just thorough. Reading what was there. They're wrong, she said. Just that. No elaboration. No cushion around it. She said it the way she said the chestnut's shoulder would work itself out, with the authority of something she had taken the time to verify. He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. She picked up the reins and did not mount yet, just held them. I spent 5 days watching you work. You fixed 3 things without being asked. You knew the sorrel's leg was improving before I reported it, because you went and looked at 2 in the morning when you thought I was asleep. You've kept this place running how long? 22 years. 22 years, 15 of them alone. I've had hired help sometimes. The place, she said, the decisions, what to breed, what to sell, what to hold, that's been you. Yes. They're wrong, she said again quieter, like she was confirming something for her own records, rather than arguing a case. She put her boot in the stirrup and swung up onto Copper and looked down at him from that height with those direct eyes. I'm going to ride to Caldwell Wells, she said. I'm going to look at the situation there and talk to the woman and decide if it's what I thought it was from the description. A pause. She looked out at the horses in the south pasture, the particular way she had of letting her eyes move over them, taking stock. And then I might ride back and tell you what I found out, if that's something you'd want to hear. He held back what he wanted to say and said something plainer instead. I'd want to hear it. She rode out. Wade stood in the yard and watched Copper carry her up the switchback until the trail curved around the rock face and the gray hide and the duster and the 2 large hat all disappeared behind the stone. The sound of hooves on frozen ground diminished and then was gone, and what replaced it was the ordinary noise of the morning. The wind through the cottonwood tops, the horses moving in the south pasture, a crow somewhere up the ridge conducting its own business. He did not let himself think about it too much. That sounds like a lie, but it is true. He had gotten good over the years at not wanting things he probably could not have. It was a skill you developed through practice the way you developed any skill, through the sustained application of will until the motion became automatic. You put the thought in a back room and closed the door on it, and you went to work, because the work was always there, and the work did not have opinions about what you were allowed to want. He went to work. The lower fence line had needed attention since October, and he had been finding reasons to do other things instead, which was a habit of his when he was avoiding the thing he was actually thinking about. He took the wire stretcher, and the post maul, and the staple bucket, and rode the lower section for 2 days, working methodically from the creek crossing south, pulling the slack out of the wire, and replacing the posts that had heaved in the freeze, and setting new staples where the old ones had pulled. The work was physical enough to occupy his hands, and cold enough to occupy a portion of his attention, and neither of those things was quite enough. He turned the sorrel mare out into the small paddock and watched her move, sound. No hitch in the stride, weight distributed correctly through all 4 legs, the particular quality of movement that told him the leg had healed without compensation. He watched the chestnut gelding in the main pasture, and his shoulder was already loosening up. A week more and no one would know it had been stiff. He cleaned out the spare room and washed the bedding because it needed doing. That was the reason. He aired the blankets on the line in the cold, dry air. Ellie had left the room as she had found it, which was to say that she had made it better than she found it without making a point of it. The bed was made with a care that was practical rather than decorative. The tin wash basin on the stand had been cleaned and dried and turned face down, which was the correct way to store it in cold weather to prevent the water in the residual film from freezing and cracking the metal. She had folded the extra blanket that he kept on the chair and she had folded it in a particular way that Margaret had used, flat with the excess tucked underneath rather than folded over the top. He noticed this and told himself it was not something to read into. He cooked plain food and ate it without thinking about biscuits. On the 6th day he rode into town for supplies. The road was hard packed from the cold and the bay horse moved well on it, pleased to be going somewhere after the days in the pasture. Chester born at the feed store was his usual polite self, the politeness that had developed its particular careful quality over the past 2 years. And Wade bought what he needed and loaded the bags across the horse, and Chester made conversation about the winter and the state of the roads, topics which were safe and required no particular commitment from either party. On the way back, Wade passed the Tanner place, which had been sitting empty since Cal Tanner had died the previous winter. There was smoke from the chimney. Someone had moved in, or was looking at moving in. He did not know who. He thought about the land company people who had been coming through, the ones who came from the east with paperwork and ideas about what the west would do for them, and he wondered if one of them had taken the Tanner place. He thought about the group of women that Ellie had described, 29 days. However many of them there had been, spread out now across the valley and the territory, finding what they had come to find, or finding that it was something different than what they had expected. The ones who had turned back at the pass were gone already, back to wherever they had come from, carrying their own accounting of what the journey had and had not been. Ellie had not turned back. On the 9th day he heard the mule on the trail. He was in the barn working on a piece of harness, a breast strap that had worn thin at the point of contact with the hame, and that he had been meaning to replace before it failed entirely and left him without it at a critical moment. The replacement leather was on the bench, and he had the old strap out and was measuring for the cut when he heard Copper on the trail above. That particular flat-footed economy of a mule covering ground because the ground needed covering. He set the harness down and walked to the barn door. She came into the yard and stopped the mule and looked at him, and he looked at her, and she said, "The operation there is smaller than the letters made it sound." He said that was often the way with letters. The books were a mess. I could see what was wrong with them in the first hour. But the woman doesn't entirely want someone to tell her what is wrong. She wants the work done without the diagnosis. She wants the ledger to balance without anyone saying where the money actually went. A pause. People are like that sometimes. "I know," he said. She got down from the mule. She was dusty from the road and her eyes were tired in the way eyes get tired after days of riding alone. But the directness in them was unchanged. That quality of looking at something and intending to see it correctly. "I told her what I found anyway," she said. "She didn't like it. But she'll think about it. People usually do." "What did you decide?" "About the position." She shook her head slightly. "It's not what I thought it was. She wants someone to do the numbers and stay quiet. That's not a partnership." A pause in which she looked at Copper's ears rather than at Wade, which was the first indirect thing he had seen her do. "I have been quiet long enough." He took the mule's reins when she offered them and led Copper toward the barn. And she walked beside him and they did not say anything for a moment. "I did a lot of thinking on the way back," she said. He waited. "You need someone. Not unkind, not apologetic, just straight." The way she said everything straight. Not a wife necessarily. Or maybe yes. I don't know yet. That's a separate conversation. But this place is too much for one man to run cleanly, and you know that. You've been making it work, but barely. "I've been making it work," he said. "I know. That's not a criticism. That's an observation." She looked around the yard and then at the barn and then at the south pasture fence line, where he had spent 2 days in the cold with the wire stretcher, taking stock of it the way she took stock of the horses, with that particular quality of attention. "I kept books for 7 years," she said. "I know how to work and I'm not afraid of hard, and I know horses better than I let on the first time I was here. I was modest because I didn't want to seem like I was applying for something I hadn't been asked about." She looked at him directly. "And now I'm applying," she said. Wade looked at her. 29 days from back east, 5 days in his spare room. 9 days on the road to Caldwell Wells and back again, alone on a gray mule that was not pretty, but was reliable in the way that mattered. Standing in his yard in the thin November light, with dust from the trail on her duster, and the expression of someone who had made a decision and was not interested in softening it into something easier to decline. "There's a lot you'd need to know about this place," he said. "Show me," she said. The cold coffee on the step that morning, all of it. The trail he had been watching for nothing. The count and recount of 12 horses he had already accepted as gone, the boots he had set by the door, and the particular arithmetic of surrender that had gone with them. All of that was still in him, still present in his chest, the way a bruise is present even when you are not pressing on it. But standing here in the yard, with Copper blowing warm breath in the cold air, and the breeding string moving in the south pasture, and this particular woman waiting for an answer, with the patience of someone who knows how to wait without making the waiting into pressure, it was not the whole of what was in him anymore. "Come inside," he said. "There's coffee." It was not cold this time. He had made it fresh that morning, the same as any morning, out of the same habit that kept the hens fed, and the stove going and the work moving forward regardless of what the numbers said. The habit of continuing, which was perhaps the only kind of arithmetic that had ever actually worked for him. 12 horses stood in the south pasture in the pale late morning light. He had stopped counting them. He knew the number. The ledgers had been sitting on the shelf for 8 months. Wade knew this because the last entry in his own hand was dated the 3rd week of March, when he had recorded the sale of 2 yearlings to a man from the eastern end of the valley, who had paid fairly and picked them up without complaint and never come back. After that the columns were empty. Not empty because nothing had happened, because things had happened, the normal transactions of a working ranch, feed purchased and equipment repaired, and the small irregular income from the one breeding service contract he had managed to hold on to through the dry spell, with the valley's opinion of him. All of it had happened. None of it had been written down. He had been keeping it in his head the way a man keeps things in his head, when looking at them on paper would require him to see them clearly, and seeing them clearly would require him to do something about them, and doing something about them would require a kind of sustained optimism he had not been able to locate. Ellie found the ledgers on her second full day at the ranch. She did not announce that she had found them. She did not ask permission to look at them. She came in from the afternoon barn check, hung her duster on the hook beside the door, pulled off her work gloves finger by finger and set them on the sideboard, and then went to the shelf and took the top ledger down and set it on the kitchen table and sat down with it and a pencil and a clean sheet of paper she had taken from the small writing desk in the hall. Wade was mending a headstall at the other end of the table. He watched her open the book. She did not look up. "You haven't kept this current?" "No, how long?" 8 months, roughly." She turned a page and then another, running her finger down the columns with the particular efficiency of someone reading numbers, the way other people read words, absorbing them in groups rather than one at a time. She marked nothing on the first pass, just read. "Is there anything in the barn accounts that isn't in here?" "Feed receipts, I kept those." "Where?" "Nail on the wall by the grain bin." She nodded once and went back to the ledger. He finished the headstall and started on a bridal cheek piece that had developed a stress crack at the keeper, and she continued reading, and the fire in the stove ticked and settled, and outside the wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like distant water. They sat like that for 2 hours. She filled the sheet of paper with figures in a hand that was compact and precise, the handwriting of someone accustomed to making a great deal fit into a small space. She did not speak. Neither did he. When she closed the ledger, she set it to one side and looked at the sheet of paper for a long moment before she looked at him. "It's not as bad as you think," she said. He had not told her what he thought. She had read it out of the numbers. "Then tell me what it is," he said. She turned the paper so he could read it and began. The feed costs were running high because he had been buying through Chesterbourne's store, rather than going directly to the grain operation that Cyrus Webb ran on the valley floor, 12 miles south. Webb sold by the hundredweight contract at a price that was lower than Chester's retail, by an amount that seemed small per purchase and became significant across a full year of feeding a breeding string. It was not Chester's fault. Chester's prices were fair for what he offered, which was convenience and credit and a location that did not require 12 miles of additional riding. But the convenience had a cost, and the cost had been compounding. The breeding service fees Wade was charging were 20% below what the Greer ranch charged for comparable stock. Greer's operation was the standard the valley used when it thought about horses, which meant that Wade had been setting his own value 20% below the valley's benchmark for 3 years without knowing it, because he had never asked what Greer charged, and no one had thought to tell him. The 2 mares he had been planning to sell in the spring would bring a better price open, which was how he had been thinking about them. then they would bring bread. But if he held them through summer carrying foals from his best stud, the foals they would throw were worth more on the market than the difference in the mares' asking prices. Plus, he would still have the mares. The calculation required holding longer and feeding longer, and trusting that the foals would be what the bloodlines suggested they would be, which was a risk. But it was the kind of risk that was actually arithmetic, rather than chance, because he knew the bloodlines and he trusted what he knew. 3 things, she said. Do those 3 things before spring and this ranch turns a real profit. Not maybe, not if the weather holds. He sat with that. He looked at the numbers on her paper, and he looked at the ledger, and he looked at his own hands on the table, and he thought about 8 months of not opening that book and what had been in his mind when he had made that choice, which had not felt like a choice, but like the absence of energy required to make the choice. The not looking had not been stupidity, he knew that. It had been the exhaustion of a man who had been surviving the thing rather than running it, and surviving takes the entire person and leaves nothing for the kind of clear-eyed accounting that would have told him what she had just told him in 3 points on a sheet of paper. You figured this out in 3 evenings, he said. I've kept books a long time. I've run this ranch 22 years and I didn't see it. She reached across the table and tapped the paper with 2 fingers. Not hard, just enough to make the point land cleanly. You weren't looking for it. You were looking at the ground right in front of your feet. Sometimes you need someone standing at a different angle. He folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. The fire settled in the stove, and the wind shifted outside, and somewhere in the south pasture one of the horses called out to another, and was answered, the ordinary language of a herd settling for the night. He sat with his hands on the table and the folded paper in his pocket and said the thing he had not been planning to say because planning was not how it came out. Stay, he said. She looked at him. I mean for good. He stopped. He was 53 years old, and this particular sentence had not needed to exist for 15 years, and he was not sure he remembered how to build it correctly. I mean that I'd like you to stay, if that's something you could want. We can figure out what it looks like. Ellie did not answer right away. She closed the ledger and set her pencil down parallel to the edge of the paper and looked at him for a moment with the same quality of attention she brought to everything. Fully present and fully honest, and taking the question seriously enough to give it a real answer rather than the first available one. He had come to understand this about her over the days she had been here. She did not say things she did not mean. The pause before an answer was not evasion. It was the interval required to make sure the answer was accurate. Tell me one thing, she said. All right. The people in this valley who think poorly of you, does it matter to you what they think? Not should it matter. Does it when you're actually honest about it? He thought about Chester Bourne and the way the man's eyes moved away a fraction of a second sooner than they used to. He thought about Silas Greer and the 2 years of deliberate silence from a man who had once been predictable in his buying, who had simply stopped and offered no accounting of why. He thought about the particular way a small community registers a man's struggles and stores the information, not maliciously, just as data in the collective reckoning that every valley keeps about the people in it, the kind of data that shapes what prices you are offered and what credit you are extended and which direction the handshakes go when there is a choice. Less than it used to, he said. Less all the time. She nodded the way she nodded when she was confirming something rather than receiving new information. I spent 2 years in a rooming house, she said. Same 4 walls every morning. Same desk at the freight company. Same route between the two. I was good at the work and the work was steady and I was 29 days and a mountain pass away from that room, and I am not going back to it. She paused. I don't want something safe and finished. I want something that's still becoming something. This ranch is still becoming something, he said. I know, she said. I've seen the bloodlines. He laughed. Not the polite sound a man makes when he feels laughter is expected, but the kind that comes up from somewhere below the chest, without asking permission, surprising and real and briefly louder than he intended. She smiled at it, not a wide smile, just the corner of her mouth and a quality in her eyes that was warmer than her usual expression, and no less direct for it. All right, she said. We'll figure out what it looks like. The next morning, Frank Purcell rode in. He came before breakfast, which told Wade something about the level of deliberateness behind the visit. Purcell ran Greer's operation on a day-to-day basis, which meant that Purcell coming to the Holt place before the morning meal had not been Purcell's idea. He was a compact man in a worn canvas coat and a working man's hat. The kind of hat that had started as a good hat years ago and had become the hat it was through sustained use rather than through any decision. He sat his horse at the yard edge and did not come in further, which was a courtesy. "Morning, Holt, Purcell?" Wade came out from the barn door with a rope in his hand, working a kink out of it by feel. "Heard the Cross woman is staying on, word gets around." Purcell shifted in the saddle in the way of a man delivering a message he did not write. "Mr. Greer was wondering if you'd reconsidered the matter of the South Pasture." The South Pasture, the upper grazing ground, the summer range that carried the breeding string through the hot months, when the lower valley grass went dry and brown. Wade had known for 2 years that Greer wanted it. He had known because Greer's own south-facing land dried out in August and had been drying out worse each year as the water table dropped, and the small spring-fed stream that crossed the upper corner of Wade's South Pasture was reliable in a way that Greer's surface water was not. The question had never actually been about the land. It had been about the water. Ellie had named it directly the night before she left for Caldwell Wells. 4 words, not even a complete sentence. So it's the water. She had said it like she had read it out of the situation the same way she read numbers out of a ledger, by looking at it correctly. "I haven't reconsidered," Wade said. "Mr. Greer thought the situation might have changed. The situation is the same." Purcell looked at the South Pasture gate and the horses moving in it, and looked back at Wade with the expression of a man who has delivered his message and has no further authority in the matter. He'll want to know about the woman, whether she's a permanent arrangement. It was not a question and not an accusation. It was information being requested on behalf of someone who considered the information relevant to his own calculations. Wade understood this. He also understood that the answer he gave to Purcell would be the answer that went back to Greer, and from Greer to the people Greer talked to, which was a considerable number of people in the valley, because Greer had made it his business for 30 years to be in conversation with nearly everyone. "Miss Cross has agreed to manage the ranch accounts and oversee the foaling records," Wade said. "She's a practical arrangement, not a social one. You can tell Greer the same." Purcell nodded without agreeing or disagreeing and rode back down the trail the way he had come, steady and unhurried, the way a man rides when he is carrying information rather than feeling anything about it. Ellie was in the barn. She had heard. The barn door was open 2 feet and sound carried clearly in the cold morning air, and she had not moved during the conversation, which meant she had been listening from the start. "Practical arrangement," she said when Wade came in. "It's what I could think of. It's not wrong." She went back to the task she had been doing, checking the water level in the sorrel mare's bucket. "It just leaves out some things. Most things do." She looked at him sideways, which was not her usual angle of looking at things, and then looked back at the mare. The mare was putting weight through the previously injured leg with complete comfort now. No hitch, no compensation. 7 days of rest and careful watching, having done exactly what they were supposed to do. "Greer is going to push on this," Ellie said. "He's been pushing on it 2 years. He was pushing against one man 2 years ago. Men in that position often push until something gives." She set the bucket down. "The water is the issue. Not the land, I know." "Does he know you know?" Wade considered this. "He knows I know the South Pasture is the grazing ground. He doesn't know I've identified the spring as the specific point of interest. Then we know something he doesn't know we know." She said this without satisfaction. "Just noting it the way you note an available tool, that's not nothing." It was not nothing. It was in fact a small but real shift in the geometry of the situation. The kind of shift that does not change the main forces at work, but changes which way the leverage runs. Wade had been thinking about Greer's pressure as something to absorb and endure. Ellie was already thinking about it as something that had a structure, and structures could be understood, and things that could be understood could sometimes be used. He thought about this while he finished his morning rounds. He thought about it while he rode the east fence line to check for heave damage from the recent freeze. The work was automatic after 22 years, and his hands did what they needed to do without requiring his full attention. And his mind ran the geometry of the situation the way it ran numbers when he let it, following the logic to see where it went. Greer needed the water. Greer had been pressuring Wade to sell the land the water was on. Greer had stopped buying horses when Wade refused, which had created the financial pressure that was supposed to make selling attractive. The financial pressure had not worked as Greer intended because Wade had not sold, but it had worked in other ways. It had thinned the margins, made the operation less stable, created the conditions under which losing a breeding string to a storm felt like the end rather than a setback, except that the breeding string had come back. On a gray mule, with a woman who read ledgers the way other people read maps, and who had looked at 3 years of deteriorating numbers, and found 3 specific corrections that would turn the operation profitable without requiring the sale of a single acre or the abandonment of a single bloodline. He rode back to the home place in the late afternoon, with the last of the day's pale light going orange over the western peaks and the temperature dropping with the speed it dropped in November, and he thought about the fact that Greer had been patient for 2 years because he believed the arithmetic was working in his favor. The arithmetic had just changed. Chester Bourne came to the ranch on the 4th day after Ellie's return. He did not come in the manner of Purcell, which had been early and purposeful and carrying someone else's interest. Chester came mid-morning with his team and wagon on the usual supply route he ran through the Eastern Valley, stopping at the places along his circuit to deliver orders and collect what was owed. It was an ordinary visit in the ordinary course of his business, and it would have felt entirely ordinary except that Chester was not a man who dismounted from his wagon to talk, and he dismounted from his wagon to talk. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hand, which was not a gesture Wade had seen from him before. "I don't want to overstep," Chester said. That opening told Wade that Chester was about to say something he felt he had the right to say but was not certain the right was his. Wade waited. Greer's been talking. Chester's eyes went to the house and then came back. About the woman. About what it means for the ranch. What it means for you. He turned his hat in his hands once. "He's suggesting the arrangement is irregular. That's the word he's using, irregular. What's his interest in my ranch arrangements? His interest is in what people think about your ranch arrangements." Chester said this carefully, the way a man says a thing he believes but does not want to have said. In this valley, people's thinking is Greer's preferred instrument. Wade understood this more completely than Chester probably knew. He had watched Greer's preferred instrument at work for 2 years, the careful shaping of opinion, the management of what information moved through the valley and what didn't, the way a man with a large ranch and a long history in a place could set the temperature of a community's regard for another man, without ever being seen to do it directly. "Thank you for telling me," Wade said. Chester put his hat back on and looked relieved to have it on his head again. "I've always thought well of you, Holt. I want you to know that. What happened with the herd, the storm, none of that changed my thinking." It was a generous thing to say. It was also the kind of thing a man says when he has not acted on his good thinking, when he has let the prevailing weather set his behavior regardless of his private assessment. Wade did not say this. There was nothing to be gained from it, and Chester was making an effort now, which was worth something. He went inside and found Ellie at the kitchen table with the second ledger, the one from the years before the gap in the records, running a comparison between the feed costs in the 2 periods. She had the receipts from the nail by the grain bin spread out in date order, filling in the missing 8 months from the paper record rather than the book. He told her about Chester's visit, about Greer and the word irregular. She listened without putting the pencil down, which was how she listened to things that required processing rather than immediate response. When he finished, she set the pencil down and aligned it with the edge of the paper. "He's trying to make the question about me rather than about the horses," she said. "If people are looking at whether the arrangement is proper, they're not looking at the breeding records. That's a particular kind of thinking. It's effective thinking. People have limited attention and limited appetite for conflict. If you give them a simpler story to follow, they'll follow it." She picked the pencil back up. "The answer to simple stories is better evidence." "What kind of evidence?" "The kind that doesn't require anyone to take anyone's word for anything." She made a notation in the margin of the paper. "The horses, when they're ready, will be the answer. Until then, we do the work correctly and we let the work be visible." He sat down across from her. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and the afternoon light came through the window at the low angle of November and caught the edge of the paper on the table and the edge of her dark hair where it had come loose from its pins on one side. "Greer is going to go to the bank," she said. "How do you figure that?" "Because the land and the social pressure aren't working. The next tool is financial." He'll go to whoever holds your note and suggest that the uncertainty of your situation merits a closer look. He doesn't need the bank to act. He just needs them to be uncomfortable enough to mention the discomfort to you. Then you're managing anxiety on two fronts. Wade had not thought this far ahead. He had been thinking about Greer's pressure as a fixed thing, a constant weight to be carried, rather than as a strategy with a next move. Ellie was thinking about it as a strategy. What do we do about it? We make sure that when the bank looks, there's nothing worth looking at. She set the pencil down again and met his eyes directly. And I write to Cyrus Webb tomorrow about the feed contract. He had told her about Webb the night she came back from Caldwell Wells, in the course of explaining what the 3 changes she had identified would actually require. Webb ran his grain operation with the precision of a man who had been doing it long enough to have worked out exactly what terms suited him, and was not interested in renegotiation once he had agreed to something. Getting Webb to a contract would require going to him directly and making a clear proposal and not wasting his time. Webb doesn't negotiate by letter, Wade said. I'm not going to negotiate. I'm going to make a proposal in writing and ask him to confirm or decline. That way there's a record of the terms from the beginning and no ambiguity later about what was agreed. She went back to the receipts. He watched her for a moment, the way she moved through the paper record with the systematic patience of someone who was not bothered by the volume of information, because volume was a feature rather than an obstacle. The more information, the clearer the picture. You've done this before, he said. Not just the bookkeeping, the thinking around it. The freight company had creditors who didn't always want to be paid. She did not look up. You learn to think about who holds the pressure points and what they actually need versus what they say they need. Usually those are different things. Wade went to the barn for the evening feeding and came back to find supper already started. A pot of beans on the stove that she had set to soaking that morning, now thick and fragrant with a piece of salt pork he kept in the cold box. She had found the dried sage on the shelf he mostly forgot was there, and it was in the pot with the rest of it. They ate at the table as the dark came down fully outside. She had questions about the breeding program that she had been accumulating. Specific questions about individual animals, about the decisions behind certain pairings, about what he intended with the chestnut gelding in the long run, whether he was planning to use him as a sire or sell him when his working years were up. He answered all of it. The conversation had a quality he had not experienced in a long time, the quality of talking to someone whose interest was genuine rather than polite, who was asking because the answers mattered to them for reasons that were not purely social. He had forgotten what that felt like. He had not known he had forgotten until now, sitting across the table from her in the lamplight with the bean pot going cold between them. The 3rd week she was there, the dark chestnut gelding with the flaxen mane stopped favoring the left shoulder entirely. It happened on a Tuesday. Wade noticed it on the morning round, watching the horses move in the cold, clear air after the temperature had dropped hard overnight. The gelding moved out from the hay pile to the water trough with his full stride, committing to the left shoulder the way he had before the storm. No protection, no hesitation, just the correct movement of a sound animal. He noted it and then stood at the pasture fence for longer than the noting required. He was thinking about what Ellie had said the first morning she was here, before the second storm, before Caldwell Wells, before any of it had been what it now was. She had said the gelding would work it out. She had said it the way she said things she knew to be true. He had been 50% persuaded at the time, because he had not yet had enough experience of her to know the difference between what she said because she was guessing, and what she said because she had already thought it through. He understood the difference now. He had not heard her guess yet. He went in for the noon meal and she was at the table with the letter to Webb. 3 drafts of it on the table, each one shorter than the last. The first one explained too much, she said when he came in. Webb doesn't need the reasoning. He needs the terms. He read the 3rd draft. It was 11 lines. It stated what Holt Ranch required, what volume and what frequency, and what price point would make the contract preferable to the current retail arrangement, and it asked Webb to confirm or decline by the end of the month. No apology, no preamble, no attempt to make the terms seem more than they were or less than they were. Send it, Wade said. She folded it and sealed it and left it on the sideboard for the next time someone rode to town. Augusta Tanner came out from the valley that same week. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon on a sturdy bay mare. wearing a wool skirt the color of dried grass and a canvas riding jacket and a no-nonsense bonnet that she had clearly chosen for warmth rather than appearance. She tied the mare at the post and came to the door and knocked with the authority of someone who expects the door to be answered because she has made the effort to come to it. Ellie opened the door. Augusta looked at her with the particular assessment of a woman who has formed a preliminary opinion and is checking it against the evidence. Whatever she found in the check, she appeared satisfied with it. "I'm Gus Tanner," she said. "I've been meaning to come sooner. The weather made it difficult." She looked past Ellie at the kitchen behind her, at the ledgers on the table and the dried sage on the shelf and the general appearance of a working room that was being used correctly. "I'd like to come in, if that's all right." It was all right. Wade came in from the barn 20 minutes into the visit to find Augusta at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the demeanor of someone who had already done her own assessment of the situation and reached her own conclusions. She looked at him when he came in and said, "Your horses are in better shape than I'd expected given what I heard. What did you hear? That the string was gone? That the place was in trouble?" She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. People's information in this valley has a way of arriving in the worst possible condition, like mail that's been rained on. Augusta Tanner had been in the valley 20 years. Her husband had died 8 years ago and she had run the Tanner place since without particular drama. The kind of woman whose competence is never in question, partly because she has never allowed a question to form. She knew Greer and she had no particular loyalty to Greer, which was its own kind of resource in a valley where most people's relationship with the man was complicated by something he held or had done or might do. She stayed 2 hours. She talked to Ellie about the valley in practical terms, about which families had been here long enough to have formed actual opinions, versus which ones were carrying Greer's opinion, because it was more available than their own. She talked about the Webb operation, and confirmed that Cyrus Webb valued directness above all else in business dealings, which was useful corroboration of what they had already assumed. She mentioned, in passing, that Frank Purcell had been to Chester Bourne's store the previous week, and that the conversation he had there had been audible to several people including Augusta's neighbor, whose account of it she found credible. "Greer is telling people the Cross woman is not who she says she is," Augusta said. "Not directly. He's asking questions. Whether anyone has verified her background, whether the freight company she worked for is known in the area. The kind of questions that don't make accusations but put the idea of an accusation into the air." Ellie received this information with the same quality of stillness she brought to difficult numbers. Not distress, just processing. "The freight company is known in the region," she said. "I have correspondence from them in my bag. Reference letters from the principal and from 2 of the clients I managed accounts for." "That's useful," Augusta said. "More useful if it becomes visible without appearing to be a defense. It could come up in a practical context," as Ellie said, "when we contact Webb about the feed contract. A reference from a freight company that Webb does business with would not be out of place." Augusta looked at her with the expression of someone revising their estimate of a person upward. "You've been here 3 weeks. I've been paying attention." Augusta set her cup down and looked at Wade. "She's right that the horses are the argument. But the argument needs to be public at some point. Right now it's only true. It needs to be witnessed." Wade thought about this on the long ride to check the upper fence line the following day, the one that bordered the canyon where the horses had been lost and found. The ground up there was still frozen hard, the winter light thin and flat over the rock faces, and the brown grass that showed through the snow in the south-facing patches. He rode the whole line and found it mostly sound, and came down the switchback in the last of the afternoon light, the bay horse moving carefully on the icy sections, and he thought about what Augusta had said. True was not enough. True needed to be visible. He had spent a long time believing that the quality of the work would eventually speak for itself, that the horses would demonstrate what the operation was, and the rest would follow, and he had been right about that in the long view, but the long view required surviving the short view first, and the short view had Greer in it. The first snow of real winter came 2 days later. Not a storm like the one that had taken losses, but a steady, sustained snowfall that covered the valley floor 8 inches in 2 days and made the roads a negotiation between intention and outcome. It kept everyone home who did not have a particular reason to be out, and it gave the ranch a quality of enclosure that was not unpleasant. The world narrowed to what was visible from the windows and the barn door. Everything further than a quarter-mile absorbed into the gray-white privacy of falling snow. Ellie spent those days at the table with the ledgers, completing the reconstruction of the missing 8 months from the receipts and her own interviews with Wade about transactions he remembered but had not recorded. She built the record the way she built everything, methodically, without skipping ahead to the conclusions before the evidence was complete. She asked him questions about specific months when she needed clarification, and he answered them, and she wrote the answers into the record, and by the end of the second day of snow the ledger was current to within a week. She made biscuits both mornings. She did not announce that she was making biscuits. She simply made them and put them on the table, and they were there. On the evening of the second snow day, he found himself telling her things about the ranch that he had not told anyone, not even during the worst of the years after Margaret, because there had been no one to tell who would have understood what he was telling them. The particular logic of certain breeding decisions. The theory behind the gelding, why he had paid what he paid for an animal that moved wrong in one direction, because everything else about him was so right that Wade had believed the shoulder would either resolve or prove not to matter, and it had resolved. What he intended for the bloodlines in another 5 years, where he was trying to get to, the picture he had been working toward that was still incomplete, but was closer than it had been when he started. She listened to all of it with the quality of attention she brought to the ledgers, absorbing the information and fitting it into a structure she was building of her own. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The story you just told me," she said, "is the argument that will settle the valley's opinion of this place. Not the current horses, though those matter. The decision-making behind them. 11 years of it. That's not something you can fake, and it's not something you can explain away." Outside, the snow continued to fall. He thought about Margaret, about how she would have read the ledger the way Ellie had read it, line by line without flinching. He thought about the particular quality of being known that he had lost when he lost her, the way it had made the work different not in its nature but in its weight. He thought about the fact that he was thinking about this now in this kitchen, with this woman across the table from him in the lamplight. "I haven't talked about any of this in a long time," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I know. It shows in the ledger." He laughed again, the same kind of laugh as before, the kind that came without permission, and she smiled with that particular quality she had, where the smile was more in her eyes than in her mouth, and the fire in the stove ticked and settled, and outside the snow came down quiet and steady, and the horses in the barn were warm and fed, and the breeding string stood in the south pasture under the white, all 12 of them, none of them going anywhere. The letter to Webb went out with Ray Dunbar, when he rode to town on the first clear day after the snow. They were past the beginning of something and not yet to the middle of it, which was a position Wade had not occupied in a very long time. He was not sure he remembered how to be in it. He sat with his boots on this time. Cyrus Webb wrote back in 8 days. The letter came with Ray Dunbar on a Thursday, tucked inside a folded copy of the territorial paper that Ray had picked up at the post office as an afterthought. Ray left both on the sideboard without ceremony and went back to checking the east fence line where he had found 3 posts, heaved by the January freeze, and Ellie picked up the letter and read it standing at the sideboard with her coat still on and her gloves in her hand. Webb confirmed the terms. All of them. The volume, the frequency, the price per hundredweight. He had one modification, a 30-day payment window rather than the 45 she had proposed, which was a negotiating position so minor it was essentially an agreement. She had anticipated it. She had set the initial terms slightly in their favor, precisely because Webb was the kind of man who needed to improve the terms to feel he had participated in their construction. She wrote back that afternoon accepting the modification. 45 words. Wade watched her seal the letter and put it with the outgoing mail, and go back to the foaling register she had been building, the detailed record of each animal's parentage and physical assessments that buyers would eventually see when they came to look at stock. She had been constructing it backward from the breeding records and forward from her own daily observations, filling in what existed on paper and adding what she noticed herself. The register was already more comprehensive than anything Wade had kept in 22 years, not because he had not known the information but because he had carried it internally, and Ellie believed that anything carried internally was at risk of being lost. Webb took the terms, he said. He took his version of the terms, which is what I offered him room to do. She turned a page. It's the same thing. It just needed to feel like a conversation. The feed cost savings would not appear in the accounts until the first contracted delivery in March, but the calculation was already done and the number was real, and Wade could feel it in the way you feel a thing that has shifted its weight, not yet in place but no longer in its old position. He had been paying Chester Bourne's retail price on a handshake arrangement for 8 years, because it was how he had always done it, and the alternative required effort that he had not had available in the seasons when survival was the whole job. The alternative had turned out to require 1 letter. He did not say this to Ellie because she already knew it, and saying it would have been comment on the obvious, which was not how either of them preferred to talk. The dark chestnut gelding was fully sound by the second week of February. Not just functionally sound, not the kind of soundness that is absence of obvious compensation, but the full correct movement that Wade had been working toward when he bought the animal 3 years ago, at a price that had made the man who sold him shake his head like he was watching someone throw good money at a bad idea. The left shoulder committed to every stride with the same force as the right. The animal moved across the frozen ground in the early morning with that particular quality of ease that is the visual expression of a horse that is built correctly and knows it. Ellie watched him from the fence with her arms folded on the top rail and her breath making small clouds in the cold air. "He moves better than he did before the storm," she said. "The storm worked something loose," Wade said. "I've seen it happen. An animal gets pushed past its normal range of motion and whatever was stiff gives way and doesn't come back. You knew that when you said he'd work it out. I thought it was likely." She looked at him sideways. "You said it like you knew. I said it like I was choosing to believe it. Sometimes that's close enough." She considered this with the particular quality of consideration she brought to things that were slightly outside her framework, things that belonged to intuition rather than calculation. She did not dismiss them. She filed them in a different category and continued. The foaling register was finished by the end of the second week of February. It covered every animal in the breeding string, their individual histories, their assessment scores on the metrics Ellie had researched from agricultural correspondence she had written to 3 different operations in the territory, and her own daily movement notes going back to the day she had first observed the string moving in the south pasture. She bound it in a piece of canvas she had cut from an old grain sack and stitched with twine and set it on the shelf above the desk where the ledgers were kept. Wade picked it up and read it through in the evening. All of it. It took 2 hours. What she had built was not a record of what had happened. It was an argument, made in the language of numbers and observations rather than rhetoric, for what the breeding program had been doing for 11 years and what it was positioned to do next. Anyone who picked up that register and read it with attention would understand that the decisions behind the Holt string were not luck and not accident. They were the accumulation of specific knowledge applied over time with discipline. He set it back on the shelf and did not immediately say anything because the thing he wanted to say required a little more room than he currently had in his chest. She was at the table mending the elbow of her canvas jacket, which had worn through at the point of contact with the fence rail she leaned on while watching the pasture. She mended with the same economy of motion she brought to every task. Nothing decorative. Just the function of the thing done correctly. "This register," he said. She did not look up from the mending. "It needs a cover page with the ranch name and the years covered." "That's not what I was going to say." She looked up. "It's the clearest picture anyone has ever put on paper of what this ranch is." He stopped. He was a man who had been living alone with his own thoughts for 15 years, and the translation of internal states into sentences had gotten rusty in ways he did not always notice until a moment like this, when the sentence he needed did not arrive in the form he needed it in. "I'm grateful." She held his eyes for a moment without the usual analysis in them, just looking. "Cover page," she said, and went back to the mending. He made the cover page that night. Holt Ranch, Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory. Breeding records and foaling register. He used the better pen from the desk drawer and took the time to make it clean. The mare went into labor at 4 in the morning on the 23rd of February. She was a first-time dam, the dark bay filly that had been in the string the longest without producing, and Wade had known she was close but had expected another week based on the signs he had been reading. He woke to the sound of her in the barn, the particular restless movement of an animal that cannot settle, and he dressed in the dark, pulling his flannel shirt over his undershirt and his canvas trousers and his work boots without fully lighting the lamp, moving by the memory of where everything was. He was halfway to the barn when he heard the other set of boots on the frozen ground behind him. He did not turn around. He had not knocked on her door, had not made noise in the kitchen, had not done anything that should have woken her, and she was following him across the yard in the dark anyway, her duster coat thrown over whatever she had been sleeping in, her boots not fully laced. She did not explain herself. He did not ask her to. They went into the barn together, and the mare was in the far left stall, lying down and rising and lying down again, the rotation of an animal working through something she did not yet know how to manage. Ellie went to the stall without preamble and stood at the rail with the same quality of stillness she brought to the south pasture fence in the morning, not projecting calm exactly, but not radiating anything that would disturb it either. Just present. The mare looked at her once, and then went back to her own business. "She's been at this a while," Ellie said. "An hour, maybe 2. I should have checked at midnight." She wasn't ready at midnight. This was not a comfort. It was a correction of the facts. "She looks right. She's not distressed." "Not yet. Not yet," Ellie agreed. They settled in. Wade sat on the low stool he kept in the barn aisle for exactly this kind of night, and Ellie leaned on the stall rail, and neither of them spoke much because the mare did not need talking to. What she needed was the quality of presence that said the barn was safe, and the people in it were not alarmed, because horses in labor read the room with the same precision they read everything else. And if the people in the room were frightened, the mare would be frightened, and that was the wrong condition for what needed to happen. At 5, the labor moved into its active phase. Ellie came into the stall, without being asked, and positioned herself at the mare's shoulder, not touching, just available. And Wade worked at the hind quarters, and the foal came at 5:47 by the clock on the barn wall, a dark bay with one white stocking on the left foreleg, and it came clean, and the mare was up within minutes, and the foal was working to find its feet within minutes after that. They stood together at the stall rail in the lamplight and watched. The barn was warm from the bodies in it, and the lantern on the hook threw yellow light on everything with the softness of flame, rather than the harshness of the winter sky outside. The foal struggled with the coordination problem all foals struggle with, 4 legs that had not yet negotiated a working relationship, the ground an unexpected variable. The mare stood with the patience of an animal, doing what her nature had prepared her for, waiting for the solution she knew was coming. Ellie's shoulder was against Wade's arm, where they both leaned on the rail. She did not move away from the contact. He did not move away from it either. He thought about the last time he had stood in this barn in this quality of light, watching something new come into the world, and whether there had been someone standing next to him. There had not been. Margaret had been gone 2 years by the time the breeding program was mature enough to be producing this quality of foal, and the years between had been fine, competent years. Years in which he had done the work correctly and with full attention, but they had been years of a single witness. The foal found its legs at 6:10. Ellie was quiet for a long time after that, watching the foal and the mare and the relationship beginning to establish itself between them in the yellow lamplight. When she finally spoke, it was not about the foal. "You were right about the gelding," she said. "What you said about choosing to believe something. I've been thinking about it." He waited. "I've kept books for 7 years and I'm good at it precisely because I don't believe things I can't verify. That's the discipline." She paused. "But you ran this ranch for 11 years building towards something you couldn't fully verify. You kept making decisions in the direction of a picture you could see but couldn't prove. And then it became provable. That's a long way to go to tell me I got lucky. That's not what I'm saying." She turned her head to look at him directly. "I'm saying there's a kind of knowledge that doesn't arrive in a ledger column, and I've been trained not to trust it. Watching you work, I think I've been wrong about that." He reached up and brushed a streak of barn dust from her jaw with his thumb slow, and she let him. And she looked at him with those direct eyes that were doing something different than their usual assessment. Not evaluating, just present. "You all right?" she said. He said, "I'm all right." She looked back at the foal. "He's going to be something he is," Wade said. The foal was named in the register as Holt's First Light, which was Ellie's suggestion, because she had noted the time of arrival and thought it was useful information and also accurate. The cover page on the register now listed 23 animals. Greer's letter arrived on the 4th of March. It did not come through Purcell this time. It came through the Territorial Postal Service, which was a formal escalation that both of them recognized as deliberate. A written letter, on paper with Greer's operation name at the top, delivered through an official channel so that its existence was a matter of record. Wade read it twice and handed it to Ellie without comment. The letter was polite in the way that weapons can be polite. It expressed Greer's continued interest in the South Pasture, now framed not as a purchase inquiry, but as a concern about the water management of the spring that fed the stream crossing that parcel. Greer noted that improper management of the spring could have downstream effects on properties that relied on the watershed, including his own, and that he had mentioned this concern to the bank that held the Holt note as part of his general responsibility to the valley's water community. He had gone to the bank, not to call the note, not yet, to plant the idea that there might be reason to look more closely, which was exactly what Ellie had predicted in the second week of December, when she had been at the ranch for 3 weeks and was already thinking further ahead than Wade had been able to see. Ellie set the letter on the table. "He moved faster than I expected," she said. "Does that change anything?" "It means we move faster than I planned." She was already at the shelf pulling the ledger and the folding register down. "I'm going to write to the bank this week, before they have time to form a view based on what Greer told them." "What are you going to tell them?" "I'm going to send them what we have." She set the register on the table and opened it to the first page, the cover page with the ranch name and years in Wade's careful hand, the feed contract, the adjusted fee schedule, the folding register with the bloodline assessments. "I'm going to give them a picture of this operation that is more complete and more accurate than whatever Greer gave them. And I'm going to give it to them in the language they understand, which is the language of numbers that move in the right direction." Wade looked at her across the table. She had been at this ranch 4 months. She had come in on a gray mule in November, with her hat pulled down against the cold and dust from the trail on her duster, and she had found 12 horses, and a kitchen door that dragged, and a stovepipe with a cracked mortar joint, and a set of ledgers that had not been touched in 8 months. And she had fixed the door and the mortar and the ledgers and written the feed contract and built the folding register and identified the water issue behind Greer's land pressure and predicted his move to the bank 6 weeks before he made it. "You'd been here 3 weeks when you told me he'd go to the bank," he said. The logic was straightforward. Most people wouldn't have followed it that far. Most people aren't paid to follow it that far. She paused. "I'm not being paid at all, technically. That's a problem we should fix. It can wait until after the letter." She wrote the letter to the bank over 2 evenings, drafting it the way she drafted everything, multiple passes, each one removing what wasn't necessary. The final version was precise and technical and complete. It described the operation's current standing, the changes implemented since the previous fall, the trajectory the numbers were on, and the folding register as documentation of the breeding program's basis for its projected income. It did not mention Greer. It did not need to. A letter that demonstrates solvency without acknowledging the suggestion of insolvency is a more effective document than one that argues the point. She attached copies of the web contract and the revised fee schedule and the cover page of the folding register with the note that the full register was available for inspection on request. She told Wade after she had sealed it. He was at the other end of the table with the headstall he had been repairing for 2 weeks. In the intervals between other tasks, the kind of task that accumulated wait time in a busy ranch and got finished eventually. He looked at her for a moment. "You didn't ask me," he said. "You are the registered owner of this property and this debt. This is financial communication on behalf of the property. It's within the scope of what I do here." A pause, brief. "If you want me to ask before I do things like this in the future, I will." He thought about it. He thought about the 8 months of closed ledgers and what that closed ledger period had cost in terms of visibility into his own situation. He thought about Greer's letter, which had been a precision instrument built on the assumption that Wade was managing his situation alone and imperfectly, because that was the situation Greer had been watching for 2 years and had every reason to believe was still true. "Don't ask me first," he said. "You know the books better than I do." She nodded once and went to add the letter to the outgoing mail. Augusta Tanner came back in the second week of March. This time she did not come alone. She brought a woman named Ruth Varley from the southern end of the valley, a widow whose late husband had run a small horse operation before his death, and who had been buying and selling horses in the valley on her own account since, with a practical knowledge of the market that was based on years of direct participation rather than observation. Augusta had mentioned her once in conversation, in a way that had seemed offhand, and that Ellie had filed without comment. Ruth Varley was 61 years old, lean and direct, and she looked at the horses in the south pasture for 20 minutes before she came to the house, walking the fence line with her hands clasped behind her back and her attention fully on the animals, pausing to watch specific ones move, occasionally nodding at something she was seeing that met with her assessment. She came in and sat down and accepted coffee and said, "The dark bay foal. What are the bloodlines?" Wade told her. She listened the way Ellie listened, absorbing the information and slotting it against what she already knew. The sire's dam. Was she out of the Hartwell line or the Connolly? Hartwell, 2 generations back. That's why he moves that way. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "I've been watching for a Hartwell Cross in this part of the territory for 3 years. They're getting hard to find." This was the moment Augusta had been building toward, with the apparently offhand mention of Ruth Varley's name and the subsequent careful arrangement of the visit. It was a public testimonial, delivered in the kitchen of the Holt ranch rather than in the street, but its function was the same. A person of established credibility in the Vasasa horse economy, stating plainly that the breeding program at this ranch was producing something worth paying attention to. Wade did not acknowledge the architecture of the moment. Neither did Ellie. But the register was on the table, because Ellie had put it there, when she saw the 2 women riding up, and Ruth Varley picked it up and read it with the focused attention of someone for whom such documents had practical meaning. And when she set it down, she said, "This is thorough. It's meant to be used," Ellie said. "Buyers should be able to see the logic of what they're looking at. Most breeders don't offer that. Most breeders are trusting that buyers will take their word for it. We'd rather give them something to examine." Ruth Varley looked at her with the expression of someone who has found what they were looking for in an unexpected drawer. "You kept books before." 7 years. For Ellie named the freight operation. Ruth Varley's expression did not change, which meant she recognized the name, which meant the reference had weight. The 2 women stayed for 2 hours, and when they left the south pasture had a prospective buyer for the Dark Bay foal at weaning, pending the continuing health trajectory that Ellie had already built a monitoring schedule for. After they were gone, Wade stood in the yard and watched the pasture where the foal moved close to his dam in the March light, which was still thin but had acquired the quality of light that was moving towards something rather than retreating from it, the particular quality of late winter in Montana, when the angle of the sun begins to deliver information about warmth that it cannot yet fully deliver. "Augusta planned that," he said. "Of course she did." Ellie was at the fence with her arms on the top rail. "She's been planning it since she came in January. She wanted to bring someone whose opinion would carry weight independently of her own. Why? Because her endorsement of you and of me is valuable, but it's the endorsement of a friend. Ruth Varley has no personal investment in either of us. Her assessment is purely commercial. That's a different kind of credibility." She watched the foal. Augusta understands how this valley's opinion works better than almost anyone in it. Greer's response to the bank's response to Ellie's letter arrived not as a letter but as a visit. Greer came himself this time. Not Purcell. Not a message through Chesterbourne. Greer in his dark vest and his clean hat on a Tuesday morning in late March, riding at the easy pace of a man who is not in a hurry because he does not believe anything can move faster than he can manage. Wade was replacing a section of fence rail on the south pasture when he heard the horse on the approach. He stood with the rail in his hands and watched Greer come and did not set the rail down. Greer stopped his horse at a polite distance. "Holt, I'm hoping we might speak plainly." "I've been waiting for plain speaking from you for 2 years, Wade said. A slight shift in Greer's expression, the adjustment of a man recalculating his approach. "I understand a letter went to the bank." "It did. The bank found it satisfactory. I want you to know I think that's appropriate. The operation seems to be in better order than I understood." This was not an apology. It was the information that the gambit had not worked, delivered in the manner of a man who wants you to know he knows it has not worked so that both parties can proceed from that shared understanding. "The operation has been in order," Wade said. "The accounting wasn't keeping up with it." "Yes." Greer looked at the south pasture, at the horses moving in it, at the foal close to the sorrel dam. "The foal is impressive. He is. The bloodlines are not widely available in this valley." "No. Greer was quiet for a moment, looking at the horses with the attention of a man who knows their value. The water situation on my south-facing land is a real concern. I want you to understand that the interest in your south parcel comes from a genuine operational need, and not from any ill intent toward you personally. Wade set the fence rail down carefully, both hands, the way you set down something heavy that you are glad to be setting down. I know what the spring means to you. I've known for a while. Another recalculation in Greer's expression. Then you understand why the pressure. I understand why. I don't agree with how. Wade looked at him directly. 2 years of silence from you hurt this operation. The pressure on the bank could have done worse. I'm not interested in holding that over you. But I'd like it understood between us that it's understood. Greer sat with this for a moment. He was a man who operated through indirection, because indirection had been effective for a very long time, and being asked to have a direct conversation about the indirection was its own kind of pressure. But he was also, Wade thought, a practical man, and practical men could update when the information required it. Understood, Greer said. What would you want for a water access arrangement on the spring? Not the land, the water. Wade had not expected this. He had been prepared for continued pressure or tactical retreat, not for a direct offer of terms. He stood at the fence rail in the March light and thought about Ellie, about the way she had looked at the situation from the beginning and seen it as a structure rather than a fixed condition, about the fact that she had told him in December that Greer needed something and that needing something was not the same as holding all the cards. I'd need to talk to my bookkeeper, Wade said. Greer looked at the house, the Cross woman. Miss Cross, yes, a pause. She's not just a bookkeeper. No, Wade said, she's not. Greer looked at the south pasture one more time, at the horses and the foal, at the register of what had been built here over 11 years by a man working alone in the particular quiet of a single witness. Then he looked back at Wade. I'll come back in a week, Greer said. With a formal proposal on the water arrangement, he gathered his reins. The letter to the bank was well written. I want you to know that also. He rode out at the same easy pace he had ridden in. Wade stood at the fence for a long time after Greer's horse disappeared around the cottonwoods at the bend. The rail that needed replacing was still at his feet. The south pasture held its horses in the March light, and the foal moved in his increasingly confident way, the long stride that was already beginning to show what he would be. Ellie came out from the barn where she had been doing the morning assessments. She had seen Greer arrive and had stayed where she was, which told him she had understood that this conversation needed to happen without her in it, which was the kind of understanding that was harder to quantify than a ledger entry and more valuable. He wants a water access arrangement, Wade said. She stopped beside him at the fence. That's what he's always wanted. He offered to come back with formal terms. Good. She looked at the pasture. We'll need to think about what we want the arrangement to require from him. Water access doesn't have to be simple. It can include maintenance obligations on the spring infrastructure, seasonal restrictions during foaling season, provisions about what he can alter upstream. You've been thinking about this since January. She turned her head to look at him. Did you tell him you'd need to talk to your bookkeeper? I did. The corner of her mouth moved. What did he say? He said you weren't just a bookkeeper. She looked back at the pasture. He's not wrong about everything. The foal moved in the thin March sun, long-strided and easy, already carrying himself with something that was not quite yet confidence but was close enough to see. His dam moved with him and he stayed close the way good foals do, still learning the geometry of safety, still mapping the distance between himself and what he knew. Wade watched them both and thought about what Greer had said. Not just a bookkeeper. He thought about the folded paper he had put in his shirt pocket in December and still had in the small box on the desk where he kept things that were not precisely documents, but not precisely anything else either. The 3 items with the numbers beside them. The ranch turning a real profit not as a condition he was working toward, but as a fact that was already in motion. He thought about being 53 years old and being surprised. It was a particular kind of surprise, not the sudden shock of unexpected news, but the slower surprise of finding that the arithmetic you had settled into was not the only arithmetic available, that someone could sit across a table from you with a ledger and a pencil and a sheet of paper and show you that the numbers you had been living inside of were not the numbers that actually existed, if you looked at them from the right angle. The chestnut gelding, Ellie said. He looked at her. You've been deciding for 3 years whether to breed him or sell him when his working years end. She was still watching the pasture. Breed him. Whatever you're imagining he'd throw, you're probably right. I haven't told you what I'm imagining. You've told me what you look for in every other breeding decision, and what you value, and what you're building toward. I don't need you to tell me specifically. The answer is breed him. He thought about the gelding, about the shoulder that had worked itself loose in the storm and was now better than it had been before, about the movement that had made him worth what Wade had paid 3 years ago, at a price that had seemed to everyone else like an error. You sound sure, he said. I've been watching him since November, she said, I'm sure. Outside the barn, Copper stood at the water trough in the late morning light, drinking with the unhurried efficiency of an animal who has learned that water is reliably available and does not need to be consumed in a hurry. The gray mule that had come over the switchback 4 months ago, with 12 horses behind him, and a woman in an oversized hat who had looked at the house and the barn and the brand plate on the south pasture gate and made a series of rapid assessments that turned out to be correct. Wade picked up the fence rail and set it in the gap it was meant to fill and began working the nail into position. And Ellie went back to the barn to finish the morning assessments, and the foal moved in the south pasture in the March light that was almost nearly beginning to be warm. Greer came back in exactly 1 week. He came with a document this time, 2 pages written in a careful hand that was not his own, which meant he had paid someone to draft it, which meant he was treating the water arrangement as a formal negotiation rather than a conversation between neighbors. The document proposed a seasonal easement for water access at the spring crossing the south parcel, specifically the months of July through September, with a per-year payment that was modest but not insulting, and a maintenance clause that was vague in the way. First drafts are vague when the writer is leaving room to be improved upon. Wade read it at the kitchen table and passed it to Ellie without comment. She read it twice. Then she turned it over and wrote on the back in her compact, precise hand, which was not the kind of thing you did with a formal document, and was exactly the kind of thing that communicated how seriously you were taking the first draft of an offer, not dismissively, just accurately. The infrastructure clause needs specificity, she said. Whose responsibility, what standard, what happens when the standard isn't met, and the seasonal window is wrong. July through September leaves us exposed during the 3rd week of June, when we move the breeding string to the upper pasture. The window begins no earlier than the 15th of July. He won't love the infrastructure clause. He'll prefer arguing about it now to arguing about it in 3 years when the spring silts up and neither of us agrees whose problem it is. She handed the document back. The payment is fair. Don't negotiate that part. Give him something to hold. Wade wrote the counter-proposal that afternoon, working from her annotations, adding 2 provisions about access timing and upstream notification requirements that she had mentioned in passing as they went through the language together. He sent it with Ray Dunbar the following morning. Greer accepted the modified terms in 4 days. The signed agreement came back through Purcell, who handed it over at the yard gate with the manner of a man delivering something that had concluded differently than he had anticipated when the whole sequence began. Wade thanked him and brought the document inside and set it on the shelf next to the foaling register. Ellie was in the south pasture doing her morning round. He did not go out immediately to tell her. He stood in the kitchen and looked at the 2 documents side by side, the register she had built in 4 months and the water agreement that had neutralized the single most sustained external pressure the operation had carried for 2 years, and he thought about what that shelf now held that it had not held a year ago. Not just paper, evidence. The kind that did not require anyone to take anyone's word for anything. He had spent a considerable portion of the previous 15 years believing that the quality of the work would eventually speak clearly enough on its own. He had been right about that in the long view. What he had not understood was that the long view required surviving the short view first, and the short view had contained Greer, and Greer had understood something about visibility that Wade had not. That the truth, unwitnessed and undocumented, was functionally indistinguishable from the thing people chose to believe instead. He went out to find her. The April air had committed to warmth after the long ambivalence of March, carrying the smell of ground beginning to release what winter had locked into it. Ellie was at the far end of the south pasture with the foaling register open on the fence post. recording her morning observations with the pencil she kept tucked behind her left ear when her hands were occupied. The dark bay foal moved behind her at a middle distance, watching her with the curious alertness of a young animal that has learned this particular human arrives every morning and has not yet done anything threatening and might be worth investigating more closely. Greer signed, Wade said. She made a final notation and closed the register. Both infrastructure provisions. Both she looked at the pasture in the comprehensive way she looked at things when she was confirming what she had expected to find. Good. The 15th of July start. Yes. She nodded and picked up the register, and they walked back toward the barn in the morning light, and the foal drifted after them at his habitual uncertain distance, as though the conversation involved him somehow, which it did, because the water agreement protected the upper grazing that would carry him through his first full summer. The first week of April brought a man named Dawson Pruitt from the southern end of the valley. He was not the kind of buyer Wade was accustomed to. He did not come on a neighbor's recommendation, or because he had seen a specific animal at a previous sale. He came because Ruth Varley had described the foaling register to him, specifically the methodology, and Pruitt ran horses on a scale large enough that documentation of breeding decisions was a meaningful factor in his purchasing rather than a courtesy. He spent an hour in the south pasture before he came to the house. When he came in, Ellie set the register on the table in front of him, and he read it with the focused attention of a man accustomed to reading documents correctly, going back twice, making occasional marks in a small notebook he had brought for the purpose. He asked 3 questions, all of them technical, about the movement assessment criteria for animals in their first 30 days, and she explained the sources she had drawn from and the adaptations she had made for the specific conditions of this bloodline. Pruitt looked at her steadily. You built this yourself. I adapted existing methods. The bloodlines here have characteristics that general assessment frameworks don't fully capture. Ruth Varley said you were thorough. Ruth Varley saw the cover page in 3 entries. Ellie's voice was matter of fact. This is the complete register. Pruitt looked at the document in front of him and then at Wade. What are you asking for the dark bay foal? Wade named a price. It was 20% above what he would have asked 8 months earlier, before Ellie had adjusted the fee schedule in November, which meant it was approximately what Greer's operation charged for comparable stock, which meant it was what the animal was worth. Pruitt did not flinch. He asked about the sire's record over the previous 4 years. He asked about the Sorrel Dam's full recovery from the leg injury the previous November, which was documented in the register, because Ellie had judged the early development context of the foal inseparable from the circumstances of his dam's condition at the time. He asked whether the assessment records transferred with the animal upon purchase. The records are part of what you're buying, Ellie said. That's the purpose of keeping them. Pruitt bought the foal. He also expressed interest in the 2 fillies currently carrying foals from the chestnut gelding. Ellie told him they were not available at present, but that their foals would be documented from birth through the same system, and he was welcome to be notified when they were ready for consideration. He left with a deposit on the Dark Bay, and the kind of verbal understanding that practical men in working valleys honor because their reputation for honoring it is worth more than the transaction it covers. Wade stood in the yard after Pruitt's horse had cleared the cottonwoods and looked at the south pasture and thought about the price he had named and the fact that it had not been questioned. He thought about 3 years of asking 20% less than that, what the accumulated difference looked like across the full period, the compound effect of small systematic undervaluation over time. He went inside. Ellie was at the shelf returning the foaling register to its place with the deliberate care of someone who has built a thing and intends it to last. The April light through the kitchen window had the quality of light that was moving towards something. The low angle of early spring not yet delivering full warmth, but carrying the information that full warmth was coming. He had been thinking about a particular question for several weeks. He had been turning it over the way he turned over breeding decisions, approaching it from different angles to see whether the answer changed depending on where he stood when he looked. It had not changed. The answer was the same from every direction he came at it, which was the closest available approximation of certainty when the question involved another person. Ellie, he said. She turned from the shelf. He was not a man who had ever been naturally fluent in this kind of sentence. He had been fluent in the work. in animals, in the slow accumulation of a thing over time. Margaret had understood this about him and had been patient with it, and had often carried the harder part of initiating whatever needed to be said. In the early years, until he learned from her example, he had not needed to practice since. "I have been thinking about what this looks like," he said. "What I asked you to figure out in November. What the arrangement looks like." She waited without assisting him, which was its own kind of respect. The respect of someone who believes the thing being said deserves to be said fully, rather than helped into a shape that fits more easily. "I don't think it should be an arrangement," he said. The kitchen held its particular April quiet. Outside, the foal moved in the south pasture, and somewhere above the ridge a meadowlark was doing what meadowlarks do in April, announcing the season with the insistence of something that has been waiting all winter for the right temperature. "Tell me what you think it should be," Ellie said. He told her. He did it without the ease he had not practiced in 15 years, and without apology for the absence of that ease, because the thing being said did not require polish to be true. He told her that in 4 months she had changed the way he understood his own operation and his own life, and that he did not believe that was the product of a practical arrangement. He told her that he wanted her to stay not because the accounts needed keeping, and the foal assessments needed doing, though both things were true, but because the morning was different when she was in it, and the work was different because he was doing it alongside someone, rather than in the long particular silence of doing it alone. He told her he was 53 years old with a damaged left knee and a mortgaged ranch and 15 years of rooms he had stopped entering. And if she looked at that honestly and decided the arithmetic did not recommend it, he would understand and would not make it difficult. She looked at him for a long moment. "I need to tell you something I should have said before now," she said. He waited. "I ordered cloth in January," she said. "Blue cloth. Enough for a dress. I sent the order with Ray when he rode to town after the snow, and I paid for it from my own money, and it has been at the dry goods in town for 6 weeks. He looked at her. "I decided in January," she said. "Not to tell you then, because I thought you needed to come to it without being pointed at it. But I decided." She held his eyes with the directness that was always doing exactly what it appeared to be doing. "I don't make decisions I go back on, Wade." He understood what she was telling him. She had looked at what he was in January, 4 weeks after she had arrived with the horses, 2 weeks after the second storm, 1 week after she had told him the bookkeeping was 8 months behind and the fees were set wrong. She had looked at all of that and decided, and then ordered blue cloth and waited 6 weeks without mentioning it, because she believed he should find his own way to the same conclusion without being led. She had been right about that too. The minister from the small church on the Western Road came out on a Thursday in June. He was a spare man with a gray beard and the habit of looking at his hands when he discussed something he found genuinely interesting, which made his hands seem more consequential than they were. He had been in this valley nearly as long as Wade, and had performed the service for Wade and Margaret in a different season of that earlier life, and he brought to this occasion the seriousness it deserved and the economy that both parties preferred. Augusta Tanner came in her good dark green wool dress and a bonnet she reserved for occasions, and she sat at the kitchen table with the satisfied composure of someone watching something proceed as it should. Ray Dunbar came and brought whiskey that was better than the occasion required, which was the correct call. Ruth Varley sent a note explaining she could not make the distance but enclosed 2 jars of preserved fruit she considered superior to anything available at the general store. Ellie wore the blue dress. She had made it herself from the cloth ordered in January, and it fit with the particular rightness of a garment constructed by the person who would wear it, every seam placed where she had decided it should be. Not elaborate, exactly what it needed to be. Wade stood next to her while the minister said the words, and she stood next to him in the way she stood at the fence rail watching the horses, fully present without performance. And when it was finished, she looked at him with those direct eyes, and the corner of her mouth moved in the way he had come to understand was the truest version of her smile, the one that did not announce itself. The minister drank 2 cups of coffee and ate 3 biscuits, and talked at length about territorial history because it was his genuine enthusiasm. And Ellie drew him out about it because she had read the book and had questions that were not polite questions, and Augusta argued with him pleasantly about one interpretation, while Ray sat in the corner with his whiskey-looking content, in the quiet way of a man who likes watching things go correctly. After everyone had gone, they stood at the kitchen window and watched the evening come over the south pasture, the long horizontal light of June going gold on the horses' backs and on the grass that had grown tall and thick with the spring rains. She put her hand in his. Easy. The way you do something you have been meaning to do and have finally gotten around to doing. The weight of it in his palm, the warmth of it. He felt that weight the way you feel the return of something you had stopped expecting to come back, not identical to what it had been, its own shape but recognizable at the bone level where recognition does not require comparison. You ordered the cloth before I asked you to stay, he said. Yes. You were certain in January. I was careful in January. The certainty came from the carefulness. She watched the horses in the evening light. I looked at what was here, and I looked at you and I took my time with it. When I finished looking, the answer was yes. He thought about what it meant that she had finished looking first. He had heard, from other men, that this would feel like a diminishment, like being chosen before you had chosen, like arriving second at a decision that should have been mutual. He did not feel that. He felt the opposite, something that had no clean name but occupied the chest the way a weight does when the weight is welcome. She had looked at what he was, the whole of it, the bad knee and the mortgaged land and the 15 years of going it alone, and she had looked without flinching or rearranging what she saw, and she had decided yes. That was not a small thing to carry. In the weeks after the wedding, the work expanded in scope without changing in kind. Pruitt returned in late June to confirm the arrangements on the Dark Bay foal, and brought with him the man from the Northern Territory named Garrett, who had been hearing about the bloodlines through the same regional conversation that had brought Pruitt in the first place. Garrett was quieter than Pruitt and more deliberate, the kind of buyer who comes to verify rather than to discover, which meant he had done his research and was measuring the reality against it. He spent 2 hours with the foaling register before he looked at any horse. Wade watched this from the barn door, the man at the kitchen table, with the register open in front of him, and Ellie, across from him, answering questions when he had them and doing nothing else. No selling, no steering, no narrating what was already on the page. He had seen her do this before with Pruitt and with Ruth Varley, and it continued to be the right approach each time, trusting the document to do what it had been built to do. Garrett bought the 3-year-old bay mare and the gelding's breeding rights for the following spring, which was not a product Wade had previously offered, but which Garrett proposed, and Ellie priced in the time it took Wade to refill the coffee cups. After Garrett left, Wade came back into the kitchen and stood in the doorway. I was watching you with him, he said. She looked up from the notation she was adding to the register. You don't explain the register, he said. You just put it in front of people and answer questions. The register explains itself. My explaining it would suggest I don't trust it to. He thought about this. About the difference between presenting something and defending it, the way the first implied confidence and the second implied doubt, and how Ellie understood that distinction instinctively and applied it without comment. You built that thing in 4 months, he said. I built the framework in 4 months. The breeding decisions that make it worth reading took 11 years. She closed the register. I keep saying this, and you keep being surprised by it. I keep thinking I should be the one who understands that. You do understand it. You made every decision it documents. She set the register on the shelf. Understanding something and being able to see it clearly are different skills. You're better at the first. I'm better at the second. That's why this works. He stood in the kitchen doorway and thought that this was probably the clearest description of the thing between them that either of them had articulated, and that it had arrived not in a significant moment but in the ordinary course of a Tuesday afternoon in July, which was how the important things seemed to arrive in this kitchen. The summer turned hot in August, and the breeding string moved to the upper pasture on the 15th of July, 2 days after the Greer water access began under the signed terms, and the spring on the south parcel carried both operations through the dry months without dispute or shortage. Chester Bourne found his way back to being conversational sometime in late August. Wade noticed it on a supply run when Chester asked about the foaling register with genuine curiosity rather than the careful politeness he had been maintaining for 2 years. He had heard about it from Ruth Varley, he said, who had mentioned it to the minister's wife. Wade explained what it was, and Chester listened with the interest of a man discovering that his picture of something needs to be updated and is not resistant to updating it. On the ride back, Wade thought about Ellie telling him in March that the valley's opinion traveled through specific channels and that Chester was the commercial hub of one of them. He had been skeptical at the time, not of her observation but of his own relevance to it, his accustomed position at the edge of the valley's regard rather than at its center. He was less skeptical now. He told her about Chester when he got back. She was in the barn with the pregnant gray mare, who was due in September, standing at the stall rail in her work clothes with her arms folded on the top rail. Chester asked about the register. Wade said, "Good. He'll carry it accurately once he understands it. He has a reliable memory for commercial information." "You've been thinking about Chester's memory." "I've been thinking about every channel through which the valley's information moves since January." She glanced at him. "Chester is the commercial network. Augusta is the social one. Ruth Varley is the horse economy. You were operating without any of them working in your favor. And Greer was using all of them against me. Greer was using the ones that were available to him. He couldn't use Ruth Varley, because Ruth Varley looks at horses and draws her own conclusions. He couldn't use Augusta, because Augusta is not susceptible to that kind of management." She turned back to the mare. "He could use Chester, because Chester forms his opinions from available information. And for 2 years, the available information about this ranch was shaped by Greer's silence." Wade leaned on the stall rail beside her. The gray mare regarded them both with the calm of an animal who has made her peace with their presence over many weeks of the same routine, the same two people appearing at the same times and doing nothing threatening. "She trusts you now," he said. "She trusts the consistency." Ellie watched the mare. "I showed up at the same time every day and I didn't push and I didn't go away. Eventually she came to the rail herself." A pause. Most things work that way. He understood that she was not only talking about the mare. Silas Greer came to the ranch on the last Tuesday of August, not Purcell this time. Greer himself on his own horse, without announcement. He came at mid-morning and tied at the post and came to the barn door where Wade was working on a new headstall, replacing the crown piece that had cracked at the buckle keeper. "I won't take much of your time," Greer said. Wade set the headstall on the workbench and waited. Greer looked around the barn with the attention of a man who has not been inside this particular barn before and is filing the information. He looked at the gray mare in her stall, at the quality of her condition, at the way she stood. He looked at the headstall on the workbench, at the tooling on the leather, at the spare bridles on the wall hooks. "The spring has run better this summer than it has in 4 years, Greer said. "We extended the diversion channel in June. Purcell told me. It wasn't in the agreement. It was in the maintenance clause." "The clause," Ellie added. Wade kept his voice level. "The channel was silting at the bend. Another 2 seasons and it would have closed." Greer was quiet for a moment. If the first draft had been signed, there would have been no maintenance clause. The silting would have been a dispute by next summer. Yes. She anticipated that. She's seen what happens to agreements that don't specify maintenance. Greer looked at the stall where the gray mare stood in the particular composed way of a late Turpin animal who has settled into the patience of waiting. He looked at the folding register on the shelf above the desk, visible through the barn door into the tack room where Ellie kept a second copy for the barn records. "I want to say something plainly," Greer said. Wade waited. "The pressure I applied to this operation over the past 2 years was within my rights as a neighboring operator seeking water access. I don't apologize for pursuing what I needed." He paused. "But I applied it in ways that went beyond the water question. The silence on purchases, the suggestions to Bourne, the letter to the bank." Another pause, longer. "Those were instruments of attrition rather than negotiation. I used them because I believed your position would deteriorate to the point where the sale became your best option." Wade held this. "I was wrong about the position," Greer said. "And I was wrong to use those instruments when a direct conversation would have been the correct approach." This was more than Wade had expected. It was not a full accounting, and it was not precisely an apology, and it did not return the 2 years that the attrition had cost, but it was a specific acknowledgement of specific choices made deliberately, stated plainly by a man who was not in the habit of stating such things plainly, and it was being offered without being requested. "The water agreement is working," Wade said. "The spring is clean and both operations are getting what they need from it. That's what a direct conversation would have produced 2 years ago." "Yes," Greer said. "It is." He picked up his hat from the post he had set it on and turned it once in his hands. "The foaling register. Word of it has reached people I wouldn't have expected. Buyers from outside the valley. Pruitt, and a man named Garrett from the north. Garrett has a reputation for not going to see things that aren't worth seeing. Greer looked at Wade directly. You've built something here that I underestimated. I want you to know I understand that now. He put his hat on and left the way he had come, at the easy, unhurried pace of a man who has said what he came to say and has no remaining business. Wade stood in the barn door and watched him go. He was thinking about something Ellie had said in the spring, that the truth unwitnessed and undocumented was functionally indistinguishable from the story people chose to believe instead. He was thinking about 2 years of carrying the weight of Greer's chosen story about the Holt operation. The story of a man whose second bad stretch confirmed the pattern of the first. The story of a ranch on a downward trajectory that would eventually resolve itself in a sale. The story had not been true, but it had had weight, the specific weight of a thing believed by enough people in a small enough place to shape the texture of daily existence, the quality of greetings and prices and credit, and the direction handshakes traveled. Ellie came out from the house where she had been at the desk and stood beside him. "Greer," she said. "He came to say something." "What did he say?" Wade told her. She listened without the pencil, which was how she listened to things that were personal rather than operational, giving them the different kind of attention they required. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the trail where Greer's horse had gone. "He didn't have to come," she said. "No. He came because he's a practical man, and practical men prefer clean accounts." She turned toward the barn. "The water agreement cleans most of it. This cleaned the rest." She went back to the gray mare, and Wade stood in the barn door a moment longer, not thinking about Greer anymore, but about the particular quality of a situation that had been carrying weight and was now lighter. The difference you feel in your chest when something you have been holding, without fully knowing you were holding it, is no longer there to hold. The gray mare delivered her foal in the second week of September. She was the mare that had been in the string the longest without producing, and she did not find the work easy, but she found it in the end, and the foal came before full dawn on a Wednesday morning, when the air already carried the first suggestion of the season turning. Not cold yet, but no longer committed to summer either. Ellie was there before the labor moved into its active phase. She had been going out every night since the 1st of September, checking at irregular hours rather than on a schedule, reasoning that an animal watched on a fixed schedule learns the gaps. Wade had gone with her most nights, but not all of them. And on this particular night she had gone out alone at 3 in the morning and found the mare beginning, and had come back to the house and knocked on his door frame, without opening the door. "She's starting." They went out together into the dark. The foal came at 4:45, dark gray, almost black in the barn lamplight, the color that would lighten as she aged, one white coronet on the right foreleg. She found her feet with the methodical determination of an animal that does not know failure is an option. Falling and rising until the problem was solved, which was the only approach available to her and which she pursued without waste. Ellie had the register open before the foal was fully on her feet, making the birth notation by lamplight with the pencil she had carried to the barn in her coat pocket. Weight estimate, time, presentation, dam's behavior, foal's first movement quality, the white coronet and its location, the preliminary color assessment with a note about expected lightening. She wrote these things with the same quality of attention she brought to the morning assessments in full daylight, not less careful for the hour or the cold or the particular feeling of the thing they had just watched happen. Wade watched her write. He was thinking about the first foaling in February, the dark bay colt, the lamplight on the same walls, the two of them at the stall rail in the early morning quiet. He had thought then about what it meant to do this work alongside someone rather than alone. He had not said that to her then because the thought was not yet ready to be words, and he had learned over the years to wait for thoughts to become ready rather than forcing them into shape before their time. He thought about it now differently. 7 months on from that February morning, with the signed water agreement on the shelf, and the foaling register grown by 23 entries, and the wedding in June behind them, and whatever was coming in front of them, and the difference was that in February the thought had been about what he had been missing. Now it was about what he had. Those were not the same thought. They felt different in the chest. The gray foal stood at her dam's flank and nursed with the single-minded urgency of new life, and the barn held its warmth against the September air outside, and Ellie closed the register and tucked the pencil behind her ear and stood at the stall rail beside him. She looked at the foal with her comprehensive morning expression, the expression that was filing what it saw and comparing it against what it expected to find. He had watched her make that expression at every foaling and at every morning round, and at the kitchen table with the ledgers, and at the desk writing to Greer's bank, and at the fairground fence with the 3 horses in April that had made Pruitt's trip worth making. He had something to tell her. He had known it since sometime in August, in the way you know things that have been arriving gradually, not a sudden discovery, but a slow recognition of something that had been present for longer than you had named it. He had been waiting for the right moment, which he understood now was a habit he had developed in the years of single-witness living, the habit of waiting for the correct conditions before committing to a sentence. Ellie had been waiting for him to find his own way to things for 7 months, and had been right to wait. But he thought he had been waiting past the point of useful caution into the territory of simply not saying what was ready to be said. The foal moved at her dam's side, uncertain still about the coordination of her own legs, finding the edges of her balance with the exploratory persistence of something brand new to the problem of standing. "She's going to be perceptive," Ellie said. "What makes you say that? Watch how she tracks sound." Most foals at this age are fully focused on the dam. She's splitting her attention between the dam and everything else in the barn. She wants to know what she's in, the curiosity. The curiosity, Ellie confirmed. It'll show in how she develops. Some animals want to know the edges of their territory. Some just want to know where the feed is. This one wants to know everything. He watched the foal and saw what Ellie meant. The ears moving independently the way Copper's ears moved, tracking different information from different directions, not anxious but interested, already orienting herself to the larger world than the immediate comfort of her dam's side. "She needs a name," Wade said. Ellie was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone deciding something. "I've been thinking about it," she said. "Since she was born. There's a name that seems right." He waited. She turned her head and looked at him with something different in her expression than the usual directness. Something that was the directness plus something else underneath it. Something he had learned to recognize over 7 months as the expression she wore when she was about to say a thing that mattered to her in a way she did not always make visible. "There's something I need to tell you first," she said. He looked at her. She held his eyes and did not look away and did not help the moment by softening it or surrounding it with preamble. "There's going to be someone else in this house," she said. "By spring, I think. I'm not certain of the exact timing yet." The barn was very quiet. The foal nursed. The dam stood with her particular patience. The lamplight moved slightly on the stall walls, where the flame adjusted to some current of air too small to feel. Wade looked at Ellie. He thought about November, about the step and the cold coffee and the boots by the door. He thought about what he had decided on that step, about the kind of life that remained available to him, the arithmetic he had run and the conclusion he had settled into before the sound of hooves on the switchback had brought him to his feet without his permission. He had run that arithmetic wrong. He had been looking at the ground directly beneath his feet, and what he could see from that angle was real, but it was not the whole picture, and the whole picture was different from what the limited angle had shown him. He looked at his wife in the lamplight of the barn in September, with the new foal behind her, and the register in her hand, and the season turning outside the barn walls. And he understood that he was standing in a part of his life that his November arithmetic had not known to include. "The name," he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. She watched him, reading him the way she read everything, accurately and without projecting what she wanted to find. "Holt's Blue Meridian," she said. "For the cloth." He held this. The cloth ordered in January, before he had asked her to stay. The cloth she had ordered because she had looked at what he was, and taken her time with it, and decided yes, and then waited for him to find the same answer in his own way. The cloth that had become the dress she wore in June, the name that connected all of it. "That's exactly right," he said. She looked at him for a long moment with that expression, that was the directness plus the thing underneath it, and then she turned back to the foal, who was settling now against her dam, the urgency of the first nursing giving way to the beginning of rest, the first small exhaustion of being new and alive. "Spring," Wade said. "Spring," she said. Outside the barn, the September dark was beginning to go gray at the edges where the east was, the particular gray that precedes dawn, and the horses in the south pasture were beginning to move with the first awareness of the coming morning. The valley held its silence in that particular way. It held it in the last minutes before full light, everything present and nothing yet announced. He had not said what he wanted to say. He stood beside her at the stall rail and looked at the foal named Blue Meridian, and at the dam who had done the hard work of the night, and at the lamplight going yellow on everything. And he thought about how to put into words the thing that did not fit cleanly into words, which was the specific feeling of standing in a life that had more in it than you had given yourself permission to expect. He had told her in June what he wanted and why. He had told her in April what the arrangement should be instead. He had not told her what it felt like to have been wrong about the arithmetic for 15 years, and to have found out you were wrong, not through argument or evidence, but through the arrival of a person who looked at what you were from a different angle and saw it correctly, and ordered blue cloth and waited. "I need to tell you something," he said. She turned her head. "I've been thinking about what you saw in January," he said. "When you decided. What you were looking at when you looked at this place and looked at me, and came to the conclusion you came to." She waited. "I've run this ranch 22 years, he said, "and I didn't see what you saw in the first week. In the ledgers, in the breeding decisions, in what the horses represented. I couldn't see it because I was too close to it, and the years had put me in a particular relationship to my own situation that made certain things invisible." He paused. "You came in from outside and you saw it in a week, and then you ordered cloth. I've said this is what I do," she said. "Read what's there. I know what you've said." He looked at her directly. "I'm telling you what it meant to be the thing that got read correctly, after a long time of being read wrong or not being read at all." He stopped. "I'm telling you that matters to me. That you looked at this, at all of it, honestly, and you decided yes. I carry that." The foal shifted against her dam in the straw and settled again. Ellie looked at him with those eyes, and what was in them was not the analysis and not the assessment. It was something simpler and less available than either of those things, something she did not often make visible, and she let him see it for a moment before she looked back at the foal. "I know," she said quietly. "I know you carry it." The lamp burned on the hook above them. Blue Meridian slept against her dam. Outside, the first true light of the September dawn was beginning to separate the mountains from the sky. There was still the fair in October, still Chesterbourne, and the valley's revised opinion of the Holt operation forming itself into something that would take the rest of the year to fully settle. There was still the conversation coming that neither of them had had yet, the one that spring would require. There was still the arithmetic of the year ahead, which was different from any year Wade had run through these columns before, containing variables the previous years had not included. He did not know yet what the full picture would look like, but he was standing in it with his wife beside him in the barn in the September dawn, and the foal was named, and the register was complete, and outside the horses were beginning to move in the pasture with the day's first light finding their backs. The arithmetic was not finished. That was the thing he was learning, standing here in the lamplight with the season turning outside the barn walls. The arithmetic was not finished. It was still becoming. And that was not the problem he had thought it was. On the November step with the cold coffee and the boots by the door, when the only arithmetic he could see was the kind that had already run its course. This kind was different. This kind was still adding. The autumn fair came on the second Saturday of October. It was not a grand affair by the standards of larger towns, but it was the valley's one occasion each year, when the scattered ranches and homesteads collected themselves into something that resembled a community rather than a series of individual operations, conducting their business in proximity to one another. People came from the far ends of the watershed, from the southern benchlands and the northern draws and the middle ground, where the river flattened out and the soil ran deep. They brought what they had made and grown and raised, and they looked at what their neighbors had made and grown and raised, and they formed opinions that would take the rest of the year to fully circulate through the valley's various networks of conversation. Wade had been coming to this fair for 22 years. He had come in the good years with horses that spoke for themselves, and in the bad years with the particular dignity of a man who shows up regardless. He had come alone for 15 of those years, which was not a thing anyone commented on directly, but which was present in the way things are present when they are consistently true, part of the picture the valley held of him, whether he liked it or not. This year he came with Ellie. They brought 3 horses for display. not for immediate sale but for the purpose Augusta had identified in March, making the argument visible, making the truth witnessed. The dark bay foal was among them, now officially weaned, and in the first stages of his training under saddle, moving with the confidence of an animal that has learned the ground is trustworthy. The gray filly from September was too young for the journey, but her existence was in the register, which Ellie had brought in the canvas-covered binding, and which she set up on the table the fair committee provided for display purposes, as though a foaling register were a standard feature of a horse operations presence at a valley gathering, because it should have been. It was not standard, no one else had one. Pruitt arrived before noon with the man from the Northern Territory whose name was Garrett, and they came not as buyers on this occasion, but as something closer to witnesses themselves, men whose presence communicated an endorsement more clearly than words would have. Pruitt had ridden 30 miles for this fair. Garrett had ridden further. They did not need to explain their presence. Their presence was the explanation. Ruth Varley was there with the particular contained energy of a woman who had arranged things and was watching them proceed as arranged, without giving any indication that she had arranged them. She moved through the fairground with the ease of a person who had been in this valley long enough to know everyone and be known by everyone, and who had spent years accumulating the specific kind of credibility that is built from being right about horses consistently over time. Chester Bourne had a table set up for his goods, and he was his newly restored chatty self, talking to anyone who paused near his display. And what he was talking about, Wade noticed in passing, included the Holt breeding program with a fluency that indicated he had been paying attention since August. When Wade had explained the register to him, Chester had a gift for absorbing information and redistributing it in ways that served his own purposes. And his current purposes appeared to include positioning himself as someone who had been in the know about the quality of the Holt operation before it had become common knowledge. This was fine. Chester as a vehicle for accurate information was more useful than Chester as a vehicle for the kind of careful silence he had been maintaining for 2 years. Silas Greer arrived mid-morning. He came in his usual manner, well-dressed, unhurried. The manner of a man who has been in a place long enough that his presence does not require announcement. He moved through the fairground greeting people with the ease of established relationships, the network he had been building for 30 years operating visibly around him, the nods and handshakes of a man central to the community's economic life. He came to the Holt display and looked at the horses. He looked at them for a long time, with the attention of a man who knows horses and is looking at something that deserves attention. The dark bay foal moved in the small display area with that long stride that had been there since his first weeks and had only clarified as he grew into it. The 2 mares from the breeding string stood with the composed quality of animals that had been well handled over many seasons. Greer looked at the foaling register on the table. He picked it up. He opened it. He read with the focus of a man who understood what he was reading and was reading it correctly, going back twice on certain pages, not skimming. He set it down and looked at Wade. "How many of these has she built?" Greer said. "1. That one." Greer looked at Ellie, who was on the far side of the display area talking to a woman from the southern end of the valley who had come specifically to ask about the gray filly's availability. He looked at her with the assessment of a man revising an estimate that he had been slow to revise and knew it. "She's formidable," Greer said. "Not unkind, not begrudging, just accurate, in the way that Greer, whatever his other qualities, was accurate about value." Wade said. "I underestimated the significance of that when Purcell reported back in November." A pause. "I should have come sooner and in a different manner." This was as close to an apology as Greer was likely to come, and Wade understood it as such. He also understood that it was not entirely an apology but also a recalibration, a public statement of revised assessment made in a public venue, which meant it would travel the same way all information traveled here, through Chester's commercial network and Augusta's social one, and Ruth Varley's horse economy one, and by the end of the week most of the valley would have a version of the fact that Silas Greer had stood at the Holt display and said the Cross woman was formidable. "The water agreement is working well," Wade said, not as a counter to Greer's assessment, just as a fact that was true and relevant and worth naming in this context. "It is." Greer looked at the horses again. The spring has run cleaner this year than in the previous 3. "Whatever you've done to the infrastructure." "We extended the diversion channel," Ellie said. She had come up beside Wade while they were talking, which he had not heard happen, because she moved with the quiet of long practice at moving quietly, and she stood at his shoulder in her good dress, the dark green wool she had made for practical occasions that were not quite celebrations, and she looked at Greer with her direct eyes. The channel was silting at the bend, she said. We extended it 6 feet and regraded the approach. It would have silted completely within 2 seasons. The agreement's maintenance clause covered the work. Greer looked at her. You managed that. We both did. I identified the problem. Wade did the physical work. The clause was your addition to the agreement. It was, she said. I anticipated that there would be maintenance questions. Greer was quiet for a moment. The fairground moved around them, the ordinary noise of a community at its single annual gathering, and somewhere nearby a horse was being put through its paces by a seller who wanted the crowd to see it move, and the crowd was watching with the divided attention of people who are interested in horses, and also in several other things simultaneously. If I'd agreed to the first draft of the agreement, Greer said, the maintenance would have been unspecified and we would have had a disagreement about it by August. Yes, Ellie said. You knew that. I've seen what happens to agreements without specific maintenance clauses. She did not elaborate, she did not need to. The history of such agreements was its own argument, and she had 7 years of seeing that history close up. Greer looked at the foaling register on the table. He looked at the horses. He looked at Wade with the expression of a man who has rearranged a substantial amount of his previous understanding and is acknowledging the rearrangement. Steadfast, Greer said. That's the word I'd use for what you've built here, Holt. 22 years of it. I've not always credited it appropriately. Wade held this, the word and the context of it. A man who had applied sustained pressure for 2 years using every indirect tool available to him, standing at a fairground table in front of his own valley, using that particular word in that particular way. It was not a small thing. It was not a large thing either, not the kind of dramatic reversal that arrives with noise. It was the thing that actual reckonings usually were, which was quiet and specific and arrived, when the evidence had accumulated past the point where the previous position could be maintained without visible effort. The arithmetic has been there the whole time, Wade said. We were just looking at it from the wrong angle. Greer nodded, and the nod was a real one, the nod of a man conceding a point rather than managing a negotiation. He picked up his hat from the table where he had set it and put it on his head and looked one more time at the horses in the display and then moved on into the fairground, greeting the next person in his path with the ease of a man who has always been comfortable in a crowd. The Valley's fair continued around the Holt display for the rest of the afternoon. People came and went. Some of them were interested in the horses, and some of them were interested in the register, and some of them were interested in Ellie, in the way that people in small communities are interested in anyone who is new enough to still be news, but established enough to be considered part of the landscape. She handled all of it with the same quality of attention, answering the horse questions with technical precision, and the personal questions with pleasant brevity, and the few questions that were not quite polite with a composure that declined to acknowledge the impoliteness while clearly not missing it. Augusta Tanner came by in the late afternoon and stood beside Wade, while Ellie talked to a young rancher from the Eastern Bench, who was making his first horse purchase, and was nervous about it in the way first-time buyers are nervous, uncertain whether his own judgment was trustworthy. She's explaining the register to him, Augusta said. He needs to understand what he's looking at. He needed someone to explain it to him as though his question was worth answering. Most sellers don't do that. Augusta watched Ellie with the observation of a woman who had been watching people in this valley for 20 years and had developed opinions about what she saw. She's not selling him a horse. She's teaching him how to buy one. He'll remember that, and he'll come back. He'll come back and he'll tell other people why he came back. Augusta smoothed the front of her good wool dress. That's not a sales technique, that's just how she is, which makes it more effective than any technique would be. Wade watched Ellie with the young rancher and thought about what Augusta was describing. He had seen it every time Ellie talked to someone about the horses or the register or the breeding program. The way she treated the question as genuinely worth answering rather than as an obstacle between the questioner and a transaction. The young rancher bought a yearling filly. He bought her on the basis of the register entry, which showed her movement assessments from birth and her bloodline documentation and her projected development trajectory. He had the register entry explained to him twice, and he asked 3 questions that were good questions, the kind that indicated he was genuinely trying to understand what he was being shown. He shook Ellie's hand, and then Wade's hand, and led the filly away with the careful manner of someone who knows he is responsible for something that matters and intends to handle the responsibility correctly. The fair began to wind down in the last hour of the afternoon. The quality of light going from gold to orange in the way it went in this valley in October, the air cooling with the speed that October air cools when the sun goes horizontal and stops delivering heat, and people began the process of collecting what they had brought and starting the roads home. Wade loaded the 2 remaining horses while Ellie wrapped the foaling register in the canvas cover and secured it in the saddlebag she had been using all day to keep it protected. She worked with the economy of motion that was characteristic. Nothing wasted, each action completing itself cleanly before the next one began. Ray Dunbar came to help with the loading and to return Garrett's deposit receipt, which had been in Ray's keeping for the day at Garrett's request, because Garrett did not want to carry paper documents on horseback. Ray was cheerful in his understated way, the cheerfulness of a man who had watched a day go well and was satisfied by it without needing to say so at length. On the road home in the cooling October evening, riding side by side the way they had ridden since March when they first went to town together, and the configuration had established itself naturally, Ellie was quiet in a way that meant she was processing something rather than withholding something. Wade had learned the difference over the months. He let her process. The horses moved steadily on the familiar road, their own quiet competence evident in the way they navigated the ruts and crossings without requiring direction, knowing this road through accumulated experience rather than instruction. Greer used the word steadfast, Ellie said eventually. He did. He meant it as a compliment, I know. She was quiet again for another quarter mile. The mountains to the west held the last of the light in the way they held it. At this time of year, the peaks going rose and then gray while the valley below was already in shadow. You told me in December that the people who thought poorly of you were less important than they had been, she said. That the opinion mattered less all the time. That was true then. Is it still true? He thought about Greer and the word steadfast and the fact that the word had traveled through the fairground in the hour after Greer said it, carried by Augusta's network and Chester's network, and the general circulation of information in a small community that has been paying attention to a situation and is now updating its assessment. He had felt the shift in the afternoon, the quality of the greetings changing, the handshakes arriving with a different weight, the conversations including him rather than moving carefully around him. It had mattered. He would not pretend it hadn't mattered. It still matters less than it did, he said. But it mattered today. I won't tell you it didn't. She nodded, absorbing this without judgment. The horses earned it, she said. The horses and the register and the feed contract and the water agreement and the letter to the bank. He looked at her profile in the fading light, the straight line of her nose and the set of her jaw, and the hat she wore now that was actually hers, purchased in July from the dry goods in town fitting correctly. You engineered the whole of it. I identified the pieces that were already here and arranged them correctly. She turned to look at him. You built the pieces over 11 years. I just came at them from a different angle. He had heard a version of this before, and he believed it and did not believe it simultaneously, which was the condition that the argument produced in him every time she made it. She was right that the pieces had existed. She was also the reason the pieces had been arranged into their current configuration, and the arrangement was doing work that the pieces alone had not been able to do. Both things were true and neither one cancelled the other, and there was no resolution available except to hold both. You ordered blue cloth in January, he said. We've talked about this, I know. I think about it. She looked forward at the road. What do you think about it? I think about what you saw in January that made you certain. What the ranch looked like from the outside. Someone looking at it for the first time. The ledgers hadn't been touched in 8 months. The feed costs were wrong. The fees were wrong. The breeding string had scattered in a storm. He paused. What did you see that made you certain? She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. Not because she was withholding, but because the answer required care. The horses, she said at last. Not the ones that had scattered. The ones you had in the small pasture. The 2 mares you were keeping through winter. I looked at those animals, and I saw 11 years of someone making correct decisions under difficult conditions. You can't fake a good horse. You can't manufacture what those animals represented. She paused. And I looked at you and I saw someone who was tired but not broken. Those are different things, even when they look the same from the outside. He held this. You saw all of that in a week, he said. I saw enough of it in 5 days to order cloth. I saw the rest over the winter. She looked at him. I'm good at reading what's there. It's the same skill I use on the ledgers. You look at what exists, not what you want to exist, and you make your assessment accordingly. The home place came into view around the last bend, the white of the house visible in the dusk, and the barn dark beyond it, and the south pasture holding its horses in the last available light. The gray filly and her dam in the near corner, the dam watching the approaching riders with the alert calm of a horse that knows the people coming. They unsaddled in the barn and settled the animals with the wordless efficiency that had developed over the months of doing it together, each of them knowing what the other would do and adjusting accordingly, the kind of coordination that is not planned but accumulated, the product of shared routine rather than agreed procedure. The barn was warm from the animals, and the lantern on the hook made the light that lamplight makes, different in quality from daylight, softer at the edges, and the gray filly in her stall watched them with the interested calm of a young animal that has learned this place is safe. She's watching you, Wade said. She watches everything. Ellie checked the filly's water level, which was where it should be. Blue Meridian. The name suits her. He agreed that it did. He had known the name was right the moment Ellie said it in the barn in September, in the dark before the September dawn, with the foal settling against her dam and the register open and the season turning outside. That moment had been 3 weeks ago, and the name had already become simply the filly's name, the way names become when they fit. He turned down the barn lantern and they walked to the house through the October dark, and she put her hand through his arm in the way she had taken to doing on the walk from the barn, when the ground was uneven in the dark, which was practical, and was also simply what she did, and he had stopped thinking of it as one thing or the other, and had started thinking of it as the fact of her beside him, which was what it was. In the kitchen, she lit the lamp and put water on for coffee, and he sat at the table with the day's accumulated tiredness settling into his legs and his shoulders in the way that a full day of standing and talking settled differently than a full day of physical work, both genuine but with different qualities of exhaustion. She set the foaling register on the shelf in its place and straightened it with 2 fingers until it sat correctly between the ledgers. October, she said. He knew what she meant. 1 year since November, which was close enough to mark. Almost, he said. She turned from the shelf and looked at the kitchen, with the look she brought to spaces when she was taking inventory of what had changed. He had watched her do this since her first mornings here, the inventory of a space becoming known to her, the accumulation of familiarity, into something that was more than familiarity. It looks like a place where someone lives, she said. He looked around the kitchen. Same walls, same stove, same table and chairs that had been here since the beginning. But she was right that it looked different. Not in its physical elements, but in its quality of occupation. The quality of a space that is lived in rather than maintained. The quality that comes when more than one person's habits and presence have accumulated in a place over time. It always looked like that, he said. No. She sat down across from him. It looked like a place where someone was keeping the lights on. That's different. He thought about the kitchen as it had been in the years after Margaret, the particular character of a space being maintained rather than inhabited. He had not noticed the difference while he was inside it, because the inside of a thing is not the angle from which you can see its full shape. He had noticed it the morning after Ellie's first night here, when he had come out to the kitchen and she had already been up, and the room had a different quality. He had not named it then, he named it now. You're right, he said. The water came to heat, and she made the coffee, and they sat with it in the October evening, and outside the horses settled for the night in the south pasture, the comfortable sounds of animals that are where they are supposed to be. Wade looked at the register on the shelf. He thought about the name on the last page, written in Ellie's compact hand. Holt's Blue Meridian. He thought about the September morning when she had said it in the barn, the fall settling, the dawn coming gray at the barn door, and how he had said that's exactly right because it was exactly right, and there had been nothing else to say. Greer, she said after a while. He looked at her. At the fair, when he used that word. She turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands, steadfast. Did it land the way you expected? He thought about it. I didn't know what to expect. I hadn't let myself think about what today might look like. That's not how you usually do things. No, he said. Usually I run the numbers ahead, but I couldn't see far enough ahead on this one. There were too many variables I hadn't dealt with before. He looked at her across the table. You were the main one. The corner of her mouth moved. I think what surprised me, he said, was that it wasn't dramatic. Greer said the word and then he put his hat on and moved through the fairground the way he always moves. Like, nothing had changed. And the thing is, nothing had changed in the way I would have once expected it to change. Nobody made a speech. Nobody acknowledged anything publicly. It was just that the quality of the afternoon was different. That's how it usually works, she said. Communities don't announce when they've changed their minds. They just behave differently and eventually everyone knows. You've been thinking about this a long time. Since January, she said, when I was deciding. He thought about January. The snow, the closed ledgers, the blue cloth order he had not known about. The foaling register not yet begun, the water agreement not yet conceived, the whole summer of what the ranch would become not yet imaginable from where he had been sitting. What did you think would happen, he said, when you decided? What did you think the year would look like? She considered this with the care she brought to questions that required honest answers rather than available ones. I thought the ranch would turn around financially. I was confident about that, within a week of looking at the ledgers. The pieces were there. She paused. I wasn't sure about the other part. The other part, whether you would find your way to it, whether I had read you correctly. She looked at him directly. I was certain about what I saw. I wasn't certain you would be able to receive it. He sat with this. What made you think I might not? 15 years is a long time to do something alone, she said. People who do difficult things alone for a long time can become attached to the doing of it alone. Not because they prefer it, but because the preference has stopped feeling like a choice. It just feels like the way things are. She set her cup down. I wasn't sure you hadn't become that way. He thought about the step and the cold coffee and the boots by the door. He thought about the back rooms he had been keeping closed, not out of grief precisely, but out of the accumulated certainty that the arithmetic of what remained available to him did not include what those rooms had once held. I had, he said. Or I was close to it. I know, she said, I could see it. That was the risk, and yet. She looked at him with that directness that was always doing exactly what it appeared to be doing. You laughed. In December. The first time, when I said I'd seen the bloodlines. That was when I stopped worrying. He remembered the laugh. The kind that comes from below the chest without asking permission. The kind that surprised him by its own existence. He had not thought of it as diagnostic. Apparently it had been. One laugh, he said. It was the right kind of laugh, she said. You can tell a great deal about what someone has left in them by what makes them laugh and how. Outside, the October dark settled over the valley, with the heaviness that came after the shortened days of autumn, the dark arriving earlier than it had a month ago, and staying later in the morning, the season's accounting becoming visible in the hours of light available. The horses in the south pasture moved with the slow, unhurried quality of animals preparing for the night, and the barn stood dark and settled at the edge of the yard, Blue Meridian and her dam in their stalls, the whole string accounted for. Wade looked at the lamp on the table, and at Ellie across from him, and at the register on the shelf, and at his own 10 hands on the table, the same hands that had held the cold cup on the step a year ago, when the numbers had stopped working. The numbers were working now. Not just the financial numbers, though those were working too in a way they had not worked in 6 years. The books showing a year that had actually turned the profit Ellie had identified as possible. In the first 3 evenings she sat with the ledger. The mortgage was smaller. The feed contract with Webb was running as agreed. The breeding fees were set correctly for the first time in 3 years. The register was bringing buyers from outside the valley who came because someone they trusted had told them the documentation was worth seeing. All of that was true and countable. The other numbers were working too. The ones that had no column in the ledger. He looked at Ellie across the table in the October lamplight and thought about what it meant that she had looked at all of it in January and decided yes. He had been thinking about this since she told him about the blue cloth in April, turning it over the way he turned over a difficult breeding decision, examining it from different angles to see if the conclusion changed. It did not change. He arrived at the same place every time. She had looked at a 53-year-old man with a bad knee and a mortgaged ranch, and 15 years of rooms he had closed, and she had looked without rearranging what she saw, and she had decided the arithmetic recommended it. That was not a small thing. He had been carrying it since April, and he was still carrying it, and he expected to carry it for the rest of whatever time there was. "I've been thinking about what you said in September," he said. She waited. "In the barn. When you told me what you were telling me." He paused. "I hadn't let myself think about it as something that could happen. Even after we were married. Even after the whole summer. Some part of me was still doing the old arithmetic, still running the numbers the way I'd been running them for 15 years, with the same assumptions built in. The arithmetic that said you'd had your one good stretch," she said. "Yes." She looked at him steadily, and now the assumptions are wrong." He looked at the table. "I knew they were wrong by April, but September was when I understood what wrong meant, what it actually meant for the numbers going forward." She was quiet for a moment. "You haven't said this before." "No." He looked up at her. "I've been finding the words for it since September. That's how long it takes me sometimes." She reached across the table and put her hand on his. Not a dramatic gesture, just her hand on his hand, the way she did things when she did them, without announcement. "I know," she said. "I know how long it takes you. I knew in January. Before I knew," he said. "Before you knew," she confirmed. "That's what the cloth was." He turned his hand under hers and held it. The fire in the stove settled, and the lamp threw its steady light on the table between them, and outside the first stars were appearing over the ridge in the way they appeared in October, sharper and colder than the summer stars, the sky darker behind them. The valley was quiet in the particular way it went quiet in the evenings of late autumn, when the day's work was done and the animals were in and the cold was coming but had not yet fully arrived. She looked at the shelf where the register sat. "The bay colt," she said, "from February. He's the best one." "I know. I've known since March." She looked back at him. "I didn't say so then because I didn't want to create an expectation that would affect how you saw him before he demonstrated it himself." He looked at her. "You knew in March." "I suspected in February." "I knew in March. By April it was confirmed." He thought about the colt, about watching him in the pasture through the months since his birth, the way the movement had clarified as he grew, becoming more itself rather than different from itself. He had known by April too, but had not said so for reasons of his own, the caution of a man who had learned not to claim things before they were provably true. "We were both watching him in March," he said, "and neither of us said anything. We were being careful." The corner of her mouth moved. "We both do that, I've noticed." She squeezed his hand once, and then let it go and picked up her coffee, which had gone cool. She looked at it for a moment, and then at him with the expression she wore when something had been decided. "It's going to be a good year next year," she said. "Better than this one, I think. The register is established now. Pruitt and Garrett will talk to people. The water agreement means we can commit to the upper pasture through the dry months without uncertainty, and the geldings' foals will start coming. You've been running those numbers since August." She set the cup down. "Do you want to know what they say?" "Tell me," he said. She told him. She went through it, the way she went through everything, methodically, without skipping to conclusions before the evidence was laid out, and he listened the way he listened to her, which was the way he had not listened to anyone since Margaret, with the full attention of someone who knows the person speaking is telling them something true and worth knowing. She had a sheet of paper in her dress pocket, which he should have expected, and she unfolded it on the table and turned it so he could read it while she talked, her compact, precise hand making the numbers visible in the lamplight. The projected income from the contracted sales already arranged, Pruitt's foal purchase and Garrett's breeding rights, plus the 2 yearlings they would sell in spring based on current interest from the Valley buyers who had come to the fair. The adjusted feed costs under the web contract running another full year. The breeding fees at the corrected rate, now established as standard rather than exceptional. 3 things, as she had said in December, the same 3 things, but now not projected forward, but looking back at what they had actually done. The numbers looked different than the ones she had shown him in December. They were larger, not dramatically, not beyond what she had projected, but they had run true, which was its own kind of remarkable thing. She folded the paper when she was done, and did not put it away but left it on the table between them. "You were right," he said. "In December, when you said not maybe, not if the weather holds. I knew what the numbers said. You knew in 3 evenings what I hadn't seen in 8 months. She looked at him with that quality she had that was the directness plus something underneath it, something she did not often make visible. I've said what I want to say about that. You know the answer. I know the answer, he said. Then stop being surprised by it. He laughed. Not the politeness of a man who feels laughter is expected, but the real kind, the kind that came from below the chest, and she shook her head with that slight movement that was her version of laughing at something. And the October evening held them both in the kitchen in the lamplight, with the register on the shelf and the paper on the table and the horses settled in the south pasture outside. The first snow of real winter came 2 weeks later. Not the heavy early storms of the previous year, but a quieter beginning, the kind of snow that arrives without drama and accumulates with patience, the ground going white in the small hours of the morning and remaining white in the pale light of a November dawn. Wade was up before it was fully light, the habit of 22 years not negotiable regardless of season. He dressed in the dark and went to the kitchen and built up the stove from the banked coals and put water on and stood at the kitchen window, looking at the snow on the ground, at the early winter light over fresh snow, the diffuse brightness of it that came not from above, but from the ground itself. He could see the barn from the window. The lamp was not lit in the barn, which meant Ellie had not yet gone out, which meant he had preceded her this morning, which was rare enough to be notable. He stood at the window with the coffee he had poured and looked at the south pasture, where the horses were visible shapes in the snowlight, the dark against the white of the ground, moving with the easy certainty of animals who are accustomed to winter. Blue Meridian and her dam were in the near corner. The filly had grown substantially in the weeks since September, her movement increasingly confident. The curiosity that Ellie had noted in her watching behavior, now expressed in the way she approached new things, directly and with interest rather than with caution. She had her mother's form, and something that was neither her mother's nor her sire's, something that was its own, the specific individual expression of the bloodlines that was never exactly predictable, and was always, when it was right, recognizable as right. He heard Ellie in the hall. She came into the kitchen in her flannel robe with her boots already on, which was the particular combination of not yet fully dressed and fully practical that he had come to understand as her version of early morning, and she looked at the window and at the snow and then at him. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep. The snow woke me." She came to the window and stood beside him, and looked at the pasture with the morning attention she always brought to the first view of the pasture, comprehensive and interested. "She's moving well this morning." He did not need to ask which she. "She always moves well in cold," Ellie said. "The cold suits her. Her dam is the same way." "Not exactly. The dam moves well in cold because cold keeps her from getting sluggish. This one moves well in cold because she likes it. She goes toward it." She watched the filly through the window. Different preference, not just different result. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him, and they stood at the kitchen window together in the early morning, with the snow outside and the stove warming the room behind them, and the coffee going cool in his hand. He thought about the morning a year ago. The same window, the same pasture, different quality of everything. The cold coffee on the step and the boots by the door, and the arithmetic of surrender that he had settled into before the sound of hooves on the switchback had brought him to his feet before he decided to stand. He thought about what had changed and what had not changed. The land was the same land. The barn was the same barn, better for the door repair and the stovepipe repointing and the various small attentions that had been applied since. The horses were the same horses augmented by the foals of the year. The mortgage was the same mortgage, smaller now by the amount that a profitable year had permitted them to pay against it. The south pasture held the same spring feeding the same stream that crossed into Greer's land under terms that protected both operations through the dry months. The arithmetic was different, not because the elements had changed in kind, but because someone had looked at them from the right angle and seen what was there, rather than what the long accumulation of difficulty had made it possible to see, and then had stayed. Had been here through the winter and the second storm and the ledger work and the chestnuts shoulder healing and the foal arriving at dawn and the water agreement and the fair and the September barn and all of it, the accumulated dailiness of a year in which two people had learned the shape of each other's working habits and their own habits in relationship to each other's, which was the most intimate knowledge available because it was the knowledge of how a person actually was, rather than how they appeared at intervals. "I was thinking last night," Ellie said, still looking at the pasture, "about what Augusta said at the fair. That she's not selling him a horse, she's teaching him how to buy one." "What about it?" "I was thinking about whether that's what I do, or whether it's just what I am." She turned her head slightly, not quite looking at him but almost. "I've been thinking since August about whether there's a difference." "What did you decide?" "I think it's both," she said. "I think some things that are genuinely what you are start out as what you do. You do them long enough and they become the same thing." She paused. "The same way tending something becomes caring for something, or staying somewhere becomes belonging somewhere." He understood what she was saying and what she was not saying, which was the same thing she had always been telling him from different angles. The same truth, the blue cloth, and the ledger, and the water clause, and the register for entry had all been versions of. He had been known, and being known had changed the shape of the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not finished. "She's going to be something," he said, watching Blue Meridian move through the new snow. "She already is something," Ellie said. "She's been something since September." He laughed quietly. She did not laugh, but her shoulder shifted under his arm in the way it shifted when she was pleased. And they stood there watching the filly move through the snow with her ears forward, and her curiosity intact, going toward what was new rather than away from it. He thought about Margaret, who had looked at the hard numbers without flinching, and told him what was there. He thought about what Ellie had said in the September barn, in the gray before the September dawn, that he had been seen clearly by two people who were not wrong about him. He thought about what that meant, and the fact that it was true, and the fact that it was more than most people received, and he knew it. He thought about being 53 years old and being wrong about the arithmetic, and about the specific way you could be wrong, which was not that you had miscounted, but that you had been working with assumptions so old you had stopped knowing they were assumptions. The arithmetic worked out fine, it always had. He just needed the right angle to see it. Outside, the snow fell on the valley with the patience of weather that intends to stay. Inside the kitchen, the stove held its heat, and the lamp would burn when they lit it at dusk, and the register was on the shelf with all its entries, and the name on the last page, written in Ellie's hand, and the morning was just beginning to be what it would be. The gray filly moved toward the falling snow with her ears forward. Wade stood at the window with his wife beside him, her weight familiar against his arm, and watched her go.